Yeah. No, we're not going to go down that.
It's bright in here. In an halogen-y kind of way. It's bright in here.
Yeah, it is really bright. It's like white light too,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that weird dome light. Yeah.
Light, yeah.
Other computer.
What's this one?
Looks like Bill tested the Skype connection.
And you have who you're calling? Yeah, ready to go? Okay. And we need to get your.
What time is it?
About your, okay. They're going to
Wow.
Oh, they're going to share their. Okay.
Fiona, for me, Henson, I know we have not met, but I look forward to hearing your.
My hands are very cold.
Yes.
Chairing this panel on the far left.
Not coming, only Skyping.
He's Skyping in, and they want us to talk, they want everybody to talk into this board, or just the questions?
So I think maybe just the question, check with Jeff.
Okay. Sorry.
Welcome back, everyone.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth, could you use the microphone that
I got it right here.
Yeah, because otherwise we won't.
Well, Hermine's actually chairing this panel, so.
But I won't have it on the recording on the screen.
Jeff, is there anything I need to do?
Just if anybody would like to speak, please use the microphone. Otherwise, we won't be able to record it or stream it.
Only this one, or all these?
All those mics, just a microphone.
Okay.
Okay.
And Angel was,
Should I go ahead and start that? Yeah.
let Angel join us.
Okay.
Let me plug you in.
Check one out next door at the library.
Hey, okay, I think we got you, but we can only see a picture, okay, there we
There
go.
we are. Yay!
Okay.
So,
Let's hear it for Angel.
Thank you so
being here
much.
virtually.
so,
It's Liz and Nabil, so they're awesome.
Liz, should we go with Angel first, or he in the list, he was last, but we can go with him first.
For technical reasons.
Go with him first.
I always find when technology is working.
Go with it.
Go with it. Okay.
Sometimes technology decides not to work.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our next session, and this is the session on trust, memorialization, and community participation. Our panelists for today are Fiona Barnett, to my far left, your far right, Kelly Moore, and Angel David Nieves. So we're going to go with Angel first, and allow me to introduce him. He is a PhD. He has a PhD as an assistant professor at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. He's also the co-director of the Digital Humanities Initiative at Hamilton College, a digital leader among elite liberal arts colleges in the Northeast. And as co-director, he has raised over $2.7 million in foundation and institutional support for digital humanities scholarship at Hamilton. So he's a big deal. He's also a research associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. And Professor Nieves' digital edition entitled Apartheid, Heritages, A Spatial History of South Africa's Township, brings together 3D modeling, immersive technologies, and digital ethnography in pursuit of documenting human rights violations in apartheid-era South Africa. So please join me in welcoming Professor Angel David Nieves.
Are you seeing the slides full screen, or is it a weird kind of split thing?
It's still in the app.
Split screen.
It's a weird split screen thing?
Yeah, it's a split screen.
You're in the lower, you're in the lower right corner, we can see you. It's actually not bad.
It's not bad.
I just happened to hit play. That's all.
Yeah, hit play.
We're with you, don't worry.
Yeah, go to slideshow up on the top and then just go ahead and play.
Is it big?
I think it projects it like it's, I think he's putting it into presenter, or like it makes a different screen.
Oh,
You have
yeah.
to change which screen you're sharing to being the full screen one.
Well, we could just look at this.
We can look at this too.
Let's look at this. Let's start with
This
this.
is good.
This is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, as far as our technical difficulties go, this is.
Yeah, this looks good.
Okay, we'll go with that then. Sorry. So I want to begin by thanking Liz Lush and her colleagues at the College of William and Mary as I join this already amazing conference on race, memory, and the digital humanities. With particular thanks to Liz for permitting me to join you remotely over Skype. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. I also want to thank Nabil for being gracious and extremely patient as we tried to get PowerPoint to talk to Skype. I know that any endeavor Liz undertakes will lead us to a robust, challenging, and nuanced discussion of power and privilege in our respective research, pedagogical, and activist endeavors. By way of introduction, I'm going to be a bit messy here, confessing that I can't advance the slide. Oh, there you go. Confessing that throughout much of this paper and discussion, I've been grappling with several themes as I attempt to get in-depth curated writing and reflection across three broad areas: diaspora, the Black spatial humanities, Jessica included in a list of digital practice, Jessica, and community participation or engagement. Some of you already know that I'm a strong advocate for engaging my students and colleagues in DH around the messiness of archive making and the importance of documenting our process as scholars. Making, and I use this word making very intentionally, and making certain that we work to better reveal the process of knowledge construction, tool and platform development, and our interdisciplinary methods, because we have fallen short as we disclose our under-the-hood intellectual processes. I believe we've arrived at a critical moment in the field of DH, where we can now begin to more radically change humanities-based research practices and offer new ways of documenting more specifically the intellectual work of digital scholarship and digital humanities. I will admit that I'm equally to blame for an obsession over completeness and the wholesale adoption of the publish or perish model of the academy, both as a former department chair and as a DH Center co-director. I'm going to attempt to model here today a bit of messy thinking and writing in DH. I hope it will begin to make sense to you as I proceed to lay out the process. Sadly, I won't have very many answers for you here yet, but perhaps in follow-up discussions, we can work collectively to think through how we might develop this methodology in practical terms. I must also add that because of the recent tragedies in places such as Ferguson, Las Vegas, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and so many others, it is very important that we not oversimplify the realities of our everyday lived experiences and those lived experiences in the community where we find ourselves doing the work of critical DH. Race, memory, and engaged scholarship are messy and require a renewed commitment to forms of praxis that reveal complexity, contradiction, and frustration over the representation of intersectional lives. Over the past year, I've been looking at and making with Amy Grieger and Stuart Malthrop's work in which they document and preserve electronic literature through the Pathfinders Project in its series of what they call traversals. For Grieger and Malthrop, video and audio recordings of demonstrations performed on historically appropriate platforms with participation and commentary by the authors of these electronic works of literature provide useful insights into the process of writing and making. It has helped me to think through the ways in which I might begin to document the process of working in and with community to develop online heritage resources. Grieger and Malthorpe have been using the Scalar platform to document the process of making in ways that allow for multimodal recording with a kind of Gertzian digital approach to thick description. In a first world context, with robust bandwidth and access to a range of digital equipment, Scalar is proving the preferred platform for this kind of work. But a greater challenge is posed in my own work in South Africa when community is to be considered among township residents, heritage professionals, and museum curators as part of the greater digital Black Atlantic. Specifically in South Africa, low bandwidth, unreliable or failing digital infrastructure, and a dearth of financial resources earmarked for public higher education is a very difficult task, especially in light of the call for hashtag fees will fall, for example, to bring an eventual end to exorbitant school fees there. Minimal computing, as proposed by the GoDH group, has brought attention to ways we might rethink choice versus necessity, while focusing attention on an emerging movement in the DH field that, quote, akin to environmentalism, is asking for balance between gains and costs in related areas that include social justice issues and demanufacturing and reuse, end of quote. This approach is a sound and methodological step forward at the outset of a community-engaged project. However, I would ask, what happens with the 20-plus-year-old Mellon-funded Aluka project that was previously well-established, heavily funded, and well-intended, though seriously awry, and impacts future efforts to contend with the ghostly specter of recent digitalization efforts, among other overlooked imperial legacies. So will these lessons ever be learned? Well-intended projects are never simply that, and more often than not, it may be instead framed in racist, sexist, and patriarchal ideologies working across the African diaspora. As Rupa Rissom has argued in the forthcoming volume, Disrupting Digital Humanities, quote, any discussion of race, field, must begin with acknowledgement of the Academy's complicity in devaluing Black lives. In addition to structural devaluation, we find such complicity in the lack of representation in the Academy, segregation within universities, restructuring and defunding of African American Studies department. I've added in this new Trump era. By our engagement in knowledge production, we are complicit, she argues, in the silences and exclusion of dominant culture, end of quote. In the South African context, sediments of apartheid remain behind, and institutions of higher learning, African studies is almost non-existent. For example, the African Studies Association of Africa was only established in 2013. Racism, sexism, segregation, and apartheid, although some might argue that we've been in the post-apartheid era for over 2 decades now, remain omnipresent and difficult to overcome, with well over 38% of the population still living in townships. Over a year ago, the very first fully fledged conference of the newly established Digital Humanities Association Southern Africa, or DASA, was announced. Northwest University in the Western Cape Province announced the official launch, quote, of digital humanities in Southern Africa, end of quote, with the opening sessions of the conference January of 2017. The conference was a huge success. I have a moment of full disclosure. I was not invited as a speaker, nor was I able to attend. So with a range of DH scholars attending from the US and Canada, however, few of those attendees were people of color from this hemisphere, necessarily engaged in community-based DH practices. The identity politics and its optics around such an important event cannot be overstated. These sorts of events inevitably require power already labeled leaders in the field, mostly white men, from across the globe be present to bear witness to such important milestones. My critique and mention of this event is not because of a lack of people of color from this side of the world hemisphere or from other parts of the world engaged in making with local knowledge communities. I'll put aside the questions of identity and the imprimatur of whiteness in the academy as colonial and imperial holdovers for the time being. However, I take submission with the claim that DH has only just arrived in Southern Africa because it disavows a long history of digital scholarship in South Africa with evidence dating back to 1995, as such many years before its officializing date, placing it in the midst of the democratization of the country as a whole with South Africa's first free elections in 1994. It also disavows a long history of transnational collaboration and community building, however problematic the result eventually turned out to be. For example, the Digital Imaging Project of South Africa, or DISA, first funded in 1997, undertake the digitization and publishing of some 70,000 pages source material related to the liberation struggle. With support from the Mellon Foundation, 40 serials from 5 libraries produced an invaluable archive of materials. Although the website is somewhat unreliable, the DISA project fostered technical capacity at subject institutions and helped raise awareness of the many possibilities of digital preservation and dissemination. At the same time in the US, beginning in 1995, JSTOR began in earnest at the University of Michigan. With the success of JSTOR bringing in roughly $25,000 US per year with subscriptions from over 2,000 libraries, the Mellon Foundation established Ithaca as a new coordinate body for digital scholarship. By 2002, Ithaca had begun to make clear that the digitization of South Africa's struggle heritage materials was critically important when securing additional funds based on the JSTOR model. Mellon supported the new project, named Aluka, with ambitions to form a new kind of archive that would, quote, unsettle the seamless narrative of the liberation struggle, end of quote, through its emphasis on the transnational struggle against apartheid. Of its many lofty goals, and the one that is still shaping digitization efforts today, along with the efforts to create a more radical series of archival interventions, was to, quote, develop knowledge and expertise in digital imaging amongst librarians and archivists in South Africa, end of quote. Unfortunately, much of that training and skill development has not happened. South African archivist Michelle Pickover of the Wits Historical Papers has warned about the possible, or had warned about the possible neo-colonial economic relationships that would develop, resulting from, quote, this North American project designed to appropriate Africa's patrimony and subvert intellectual property rights and national heritage, end of quote. Ultimately, DISA handed over its materials to Aluka in a worldwide, perpetual, non-exclusive, royalty-free license to all of its content. Aluka now retains the rights to these items, locked behind paywalls with high-resolution holdings kept outside of South Africa, producing what some have called a new kind of imperialism, reinforcing the race-based digital divide. With this one example firmly in mind, I maintain that community engagement remains problematic at the institutional level for a whole host of complex reasons, with many of those involving uncertainty how the process of digitization and preservation responds to local needs and the limitations of existing infrastructure. As long ago as 2003, with Keith Breckenridge in The Politics of the Parallel Archive, quote, digital archival production of existing materials and born digital records has collapsed in contemporary South Africa. End of quote, because of the many difficulties surrounding the Mellon-funded collaboration between Aluka, the Digital Imaging Project of South Africa, and the University of Michigan. Pivoting 180 degrees to a couple of case studies that have sat on my desk recently, but I promise I will return to the topic of messiness, making, and community building shortly. In a recent article for Gentry Sayers, Making Things and Drawing Boundaries, in the Debates in the Digital Humanities series, my co-authors Elaine Sullivan, Lisa Snyder, and I argue that the creation of three-dimensional virtual reconstruction models of historic sites is a new form of knowledge production equivalent to traditional textual analysis that requires a better process for documenting their making. We also argue that the process of making a computer model, scholars perform many of the same steps described in their argumentative workflow in traditional humanistic scholarship. The primary difference is that the final product is an interactive environment. It may well incorporate a reader's liner notes, for example, and it contains not only the written word, but perhaps graphical analysis as well. A more traditional humanities-based process might include, quote, identifying a research question, gathering and critically analyzing the materials, both primary and secondary, that inform that question, and writing an interpretive analysis using selected elements from materials to support and communicate an argument. None of this is surprising or revelatory per se, as scholars have been exposed for some time, I'd say over 25 years, 3D modeling in DH through the work of Chris Johansson, Diane Favreau, Bernie Fisher, and even Susan Schreidman, one of the editors of the Blackwell Companion. In evaluating the resulting scholarship, reviewers are asked almost universally to gauge the work and its potential impact on their field. Is the research question important? Did the author use appropriate source materials, both in terms of quantity and quality? Were the source materials harnessed to make a convincing argument? Did the author approach the question in a unique or interesting way? The question that does not get asked, however, and is perhaps implicit, and I'm now arguing should not be among DH practitioners, is how did you arrive at your conclusions, summaries, or neatly organized narrative or graphical display at what moment, or incorporating real-time sustainability over the length of the project? What were the steps you've taken in the research process that pointed you towards these set of answers? I wonder how you might answer the so what question in your narrative or whatever the final product might be. In other words, walk me through your process. This is not an easy task to undertake because it requires a very different way of engaging with the humanities-based research process from its onset that will help document that walkthrough of your questions, your methods, your form of knowledge production, and ultimately what your contribution might be to the field. In part, this also requires a very different approach to the documentary process when, as an activist scholar, you are engaged in community building, i.e. the researcher is taking into account community opinion, analysis, design, cost, ethics, and equity, and making. There's that word again. Things that are all inherently messy, complex, and a challenge present given the modes of scholarly production already available to us that might only show some aspects of that work in process. This past summer with our colleagues at Maynooth, along with 16 other scholars and practitioners, we began to theorize and make a series of claims that furthered the arguments around 3D modeling and virtual reconstructions to now be seen in a framework of a rather long and well-established area in the DH field of scholarly editions. The question is begged, can we simply apply these sorts of analyses, annotation, and techniques to our efforts in 3D historical reconstruction modeling? Practices and standards such as the use of TEI, XML, have revolutionized the ways in which scholars may access written word, from modernist texts, Shakespearean folios, to inscriptions from antiquity. Increasingly, web-based technologies have made it possible to publish non-linguistic texts, such as images or musical scores, but the publication of 3D worlds or environments entails challenges well above those required for image-based editions. A successful 3D edition will provide users reliable academic material within the context of a three-dimensional virtual environment, such as a reconstruction of a cultural heritage site or a historical event. In addition to the processes and apparatus of traditional academic publishing, 3D digital editions must accommodate the range of technologies used by scholars to answer specific research questions and provide mechanisms to embed academic argumentation and deep annotations within a virtual space. A 3D edition is unique because it allows for the publication of interactive experiences that cannot be reproduced in print form. The publishing options currently available for 3D work are limited, with models used primarily for the creation of static images and captured video. Our proposed project would break new ground by emphasizing the interactivity of 3D models with the goal of letting readers interrogate the models, change variables, identify ambiguities, trace the process of knowledge creation. There are a number of challenges unique to publishing 3D work. A multiplicity of disciplines is involved with 3D objects of some kind, and each brings its own research objectives, communities of practice, and publishing expectations. This variety is further confounded by the arrays of technologies available for developing, disseminating, and interacting with 3D content. Modeling software ranges from the basic to the complex. Projects can also be disseminated as desktop virtual reality or an online immersive virtual world. At this moment, no single publication platform wholly addresses the needs of the academic 3D community, enforcing the need for a publishing model that can collectively develop for this unique form of scholarship. In addition, the lack of peer-reviewed publishing options and examples of successfully completed projects, along with the necessary infrastructure to create such works, remain limited, costly, and are often one-offs, requiring constant hand coding after every browser update. The need for direct integration of 3D scholarly content in publishing across a number of fields is clear from recent, yet still very limited experiments at integrating this material into otherwise traditionally conceived peer-reviewed journals and monographs. Moreover, little attention has been paid to ways that an intersectional framework might inform the making of 3D digital edition environment or platform. My work in South Africa speaks to the challenges of representing history and heritage at places characterized by ephemerality and/or absence. These include disappearance through age and degradation, intentional political suppression, contradicting narratives, and uncertainty and knowledge gaps. My projects combine texts, objects, architecture, maps, and the consideration of human action in a past three-dimensional world to create a layered means of accessing primary and secondary source materials. My most recent work, including a case study I'd like to discuss very briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, attempts to recover the history of the LGBTQIA activists in the anti-apartheid movement, which examines contested events or hidden difficult histories in ways not currently possible in standard or currently available online publication platforms. Our work to build the social justice history platform integrates time, space, and text in ways that necessitate sophisticated solutions for powerful 3D content. Over the past year and a half, I've been involved in developing this 3D and virtual reality-enabled software, now in alpha form, built atop the Unity platform. The social justice history platform was designed within a kind of digital edition paradigm and is able to display both 2D geospatial information, such as maps, photographs, and records, and 3D representations of landscapes, locations, and also 3D models of historical buildings and objects. Embedding video testimony of human rights violations committed by the apartheid state is now possible, but requires robust features of a digital edition for comparing multiple and often contradictory accounts of these events. Testimony told to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, to the courts for cases beyond the confines of the official TRC process, and more recent ethnographic interviews with scholars require a more robust set of features for textual analysis. In cooperation with community leaders, former student activists, family members, I'm attempting to recover the history of a young 14-year-old boy named Stompie Seppi and 2 other boys killed by the Mandela United Football Club in the late 1980s for suspicion of being government informants working against the African National Congress. Those deaths, believed to have been orchestrated by Winnie Madikizela Mandela during the time of Nelson Mandela's incarceration, remain contested, even erased, and the histories told about the tumultuous 1980s and the fight against the apartheid regime. I'm hoping to shed new light on this difficult past where not only race, racial hatred, and violence must be more carefully discussed, but also the ways in which sexuality and sexual identity were used as tools of the state to mark Black bodies as less than or unable to be seen as legitimate heroes and heroines of the liberation struggle, both at that time and even today at many historic sites across South Africa. In Stompie's case, suspicion over his sexuality and intimations of alleged abuse by a white Methodist pastor marked his body as illegitimate, incapable of being a true struggle leader, despite his age and his unique ability and charisma, whereby he organized school-age children by the hundreds, some would even say thousands, in protest in the mid to late 1980s. This denial of a more complex layering of history, the messiness involved in telling of the lived reality of this queer youth killed in Mandela's own house, which few are willing to discuss, let alone remember in any detail, perhaps, as I've argued before, one of the most glaring examples where the queer and activist communities are suppressed or erased in contemporary liberation histories. So can the methods and technologies currently available and those proposed by the larger project to build the 3D digital edition platform capable of casting new light on human rights violations that many would prefer to remain erased, hidden, or lost, be represented effectively, and more importantly, affectively? What are the tangible political and social and economic costs, something that an intersectional framework might help us to recover, of capturing those memories of someone such as Stompie in the history of the liberation struggle today? Speaking practically, would tourists of the Black Atlantic be interested in and even compelled to visit sites to discuss this LGBTQIA history? Perhaps more importantly than any question I've asked you today, of many, how do we address issues of visibility, hypervisibility, and how the archive, or in this case, 3D digital edition, while preserving erased and important histories in the process, may make some vulnerable? I'm left asking this question over and over in my mind and in my work. I will end in part with Ruchika Rizum's powerful conclusion to her essay in Disrupting Digital Humanities, where she writes, "A conversation, quote, can only progress if we recognize the context in which we labor, the structures of race that surround all of us, linking our fates. Race in the digital humanities cannot be a conversation ended before it can even begin. Rather, it requires attention to the building blocks of engagement, showing generosity and patience, knowing when to listen, and learning when to speak." Quote. And now to return to the messiness at hand as I close. At the start of the talk, I wanted to advocate for the messiness of archive making and the importance of documenting our process as scholars, making the community. We are very consciously making new histories and new narratives. We are culling documentation and information from previous silent members of the community, and this information is contested even among the community's principals. We've fallen short as we disclose our under-the-hood intellectual processes. In the case of the Black lives across the diaspora and those of others in the global South, these new practices become an important element of any digital project. Rebuilding trust today, and as part of a messy thinking and writing methodology or process, might mean a significant recalibration of our academic workflow, including promotion and tenure guidelines, such that process and making are understood as equally important intellectual endeavors. We've arrived at a moment in the field of DH, I believe, where we can now begin to more fully, radically change research practices and offer new ways of documenting, more specifically, the intellectual work of digital scholarship and digital humanities. Along with research methods demanding generosity and patience, knowing when to listen, and when to learn to speak, I would add knowing the value of Black lives, or really any marginalized groups, to our common human experience, which requires a major shift in our knowledge-making practices in the digital humanities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Fiona Barnett. And am I right that, Fiona, that you are a PhD candidate in the literature program and women's studies at Duke University? She's currently at work on her dissertation titled Turning the Body Inside Out, which is a genealogy of the fantasy that the body requires investigation and traces the attachment to the kind of knowledges that can be produced by examining the body, both inside and out. She graduated with a BA in Modern Culture and Media from Brown University, then spent several years working in a multimedia studio in Vancouver. She is fascinated with both the practical and theoretical implications of digital media and learning, and has incorporated digital pedagogical techniques in her classes at Duke, and participation with several online communities. She's also developed a workshop on how to incorporate digital media and learning for fellow teachers, and is always trying new tools to use within the college environment. In particular, she's fascinated with the ability of the digital environment to promote a different kind of conversation, and is especially thrilled when that energy spills over into the RL, walls of the classroom itself. Please welcome Fiona Barnett.
Thank you, everyone. As it's been said a few times, I really want to thank Liz and the rest of her team here, as well as the amazing student volunteers for putting on this extremely special space. Those of us who do interdisciplinary work are used to feeling very out of place, and it's such a pure joy to be reunited with some of my biggest interlocutors in an intimate conversation. As a few people mentioned yesterday, much of the conversations happening in this space are not the beginnings of our relationships. And a lot of the speakers have been configured in different configurations to collaborate in developing such fields as Transform DH, Queer OS, Black Code Studies, and Afrofuturism. These conversations here this weekend would literally not be happening without those forged friendships and conversations over, for at least me and our cohort, the better part of a decade. And this weekend will undoubtedly inspire another round of research projects and kinship networks. I don't think I'm alone in saying that spaces like this have literally given us academic life, so thank you so much, Liz. Yesterday, coming into Williamsburg, we drove by a giant flag on the way, and the driver pointed it out. At first, I thought he was a friendly face because he mentioned that the Confederate flag every few weeks is taken down by someone, and then the owner replaces it each time. And then he goes on to say, but it's weird, it's not really talked about much. They never use it as a landmark on the radio. Like they never say traffic is backed up to the Confederate flag. For some reason, that quote kept going around in my head last night. And I think it's because this question of landmarks and what we use as landmarks to reference our theoretical directions and our objects of inquiry, our genealogies of conversations. Yesterday in the Queer DH panel, one of the questions that came up was referencing the possibility of intersecting between the recuperating work of archives and the discovering and showcasing of community histories that are out there versus the theoretical work of Queer DH, thinking through the algorithms and platforms that constitute these systems. Hopefully, as the question and answer period showed, it's not an either or in this conversation, but rather an understanding how the platform and the content itself is constituted by our desire to make it so. Keep that in the back of your mind during the rest of my comments, because in some ways, this is sort of a response to that. I also want to think about how the stories that we tell as collections or as archives are not just benignly collected, but how we also tell our own moment by writing the history from whence we came. We are constituted by the stories we tell about our origins and genealogies. And so I want to think about how the telling of the digital humanities story right now is constituting our own sense of possibility, not just for this moment, but for also what comes next. In thinking about this panel and what I'd like to present, at first I prepared a talk on my ongoing research on Sarah Bartman and her autopsy report that I found and translated, and putting it into context with the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement and how we can think about the archives of dead bodies as a way to contextualize the circulation and photos of the cadavers of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and on and on and on. Like Jackie and others here, I'm interested in how bodies become evidence of something, or how bodies become evidence themselves. If the autopsy is a technology for making visible the interior of the body, the circulation of those images is making something else visible, something like postmortem subjectivity. But maybe it's my mood, maybe it's my frustration with the academy, maybe it's the political moment, maybe I'm exhausted by all of us trying to get our arguments just right, by trying to get the archives right, by trying to get our interpretation right. We've been doing all these things right, and now we have these neo-Nazis marching in the state, in this very state, and a Cheeto in chief. So I'm exhausted by trying to get it all right. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which algorithms now are being constituted as a way of getting right the stories in our digital world, right? Like the Facebook algorithm. Now everybody's up in arms because Instagram no longer is chronological. There's also an algorithm. And so thinking about the ways in which this idea of like solving the solution of the algorithm is going to solve the content in our digital interfaces. I'm also really frustrated with this idea that like that is going to solve the way that we interact with each other in digital spaces. So here's trying to think about algorithms of resistance in 5 scenes. Don't get scared, this is less about specific algorithms in use and more about how the word is functioning right now as a kind of knowledge around political questions, beings, aspirations, and what slips outside, and how we talk about the raw data that is fed into algorithms that give us new knowledge. Scene 1. This time last year, just a little before the great unthinkable happened, back in the land of the nice and solid 85% algorithmically derived probability of avoiding the great unthinkable, I was at a workshop where another new mapping tool was being shown off. They promised that this tool would not only be able to intake diverse data points, but be able to spit out various kinds of overlapping and contingent cartographies based on whatever weight you gave to each data set. It was really nicely designed, but I wasn't entirely sure what it did or what problem it was trying to solve. Or how it was different than other emergent mapping tools that I've seen in the last few years. So I asked that question. His response was that the tool would take unruly data and process it. In case you're wondering, yes, he said those words. We take unruly data and we process it. The rest of the answer was pragmatically sound, but that sentence, unruly data and processing it, has been rattling around for me ever since. Scene 2, Standing Rock. Earlier this year, late one night, I saw my first friend check into the protests at Standing Rock in North Dakota on Facebook. This is a friend who actually would conceivably go to Standing Rock in the middle of winter, so I hover between the heart reaction and the wow reaction, not really quite sure if I should give her love or surprise. And she quickly responded that a follow-up post would be coming. Of course, that follow-up post was the one that read, the Morton County Sheriff's Department has been using Facebook check-ins to find out who is at Standing Rock in order to target them in attempts to disrupt the prayer camps. So water protectors are calling on everyone to check in at Standing Rock to overwhelm and confuse them. This concrete action can protect people putting their bodies and well-being on the line that we can do without leaving our homes. And then it tells you how to actually do this and make your status public, and then how to also follow up so that people don't actually think you're at Standing Rock. One of the last instructions was saying, say Randing Stock instead of Standing Rock in clarification posts, so that when they filter and search out those terms, your post is visible to the right people. By the next morning, it appeared as though the vast majority of my network was now in North Dakota. The stated intent to confuse the police tracking algorithm by flooding with too much data so that those who were really putting out geotags would be hidden in the rest of the junk data generated by these check-ins. My own initial analysis was to note the juxtaposition that those of us supporting indigenous land sovereignty were now checking in uninvited to that same land's digital marker. And of course, there were all the usual reactionary charges of lazy slacktivism. But for literally an overnight takeover, there was a remarkable understanding of the ways in which geotagging is used by state agencies to track and coordinate police responses. This type of tracking is widely understood to play a key role in the police surveillance of Ferguson. We should note that the prelude in the post states that this is a concrete action that that can protect people putting their bodies and well-being on the line that we can do without leaving our own homes. The stated mission was to offer our unruly data since our bodies were not there. Understanding this, at minimum, loose affiliation of our data being connected to our bodies. It seems like one of the true first viral actions, which wasn't just about expressing support, but was about offering data to obfuscate the surveilled data. Scene 3, the Empire. Then this time last year, the great unthinkable. Like many of you, I suspect I wasn't lulled into a false sense of security because I believed the country was somehow immune to racism and misogyny, but because nearly every single election predictor, including right-leaning pollsters, pointed to a clearly favorable outcome for Clinton. Even in the closer polls, she still came out every single time. There have been hundreds of post-election think pieces and analytical blogs with titles like, Clinton's data-driven campaign relied heavily on an algorithm named Ada. What didn't she see? It's unclear if the she refers to Ada or Clinton. And quote, how data failed us in calling an election. Another one called Epic Fail, the algorithm. And my personal favorite, the data said Clinton would win. Why you shouldn't have believed it. Thanks, New York Times, for that helpful post-election analysis that came a little bit too late. I'm less interested in the specific algorithmic failure of those models, though I'm glad others have done deep analysis, and more interested here to note that many have referred to the, quote, unquantifiable sentiments, which is the category they use when their polls can't quite capture things like the power of white terror known as alt-right racism, misogyny, and false narratives of scarcity. One of the campaign promises from Donald Trump was the creation of what is colloquially being referred to as the Muslim registry. There are now several campaigns where non-Muslims can promise to register themselves as well, with the goal to confuse immigration authorities under the premise that more names to consider mean more names to vet and the possibility of obfuscation under sheer amounts of data. As a new resident of the United States of America, I would like to say there's not actually just a list. You have to do a lot of applications, and there's a lot of paperwork, and that would never actually work. Two things I'd also like to note in terms of probability of this obfuscation of the data. One, after 9/11, there was a Muslim registry called NSEERS, National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. For those now saying that they will register if there is a registry, it's important to clarify there was a registry and none of you actually registered. I would like to think that we know better and will do better, but those pesky, quote, unquantifiable sentiments seem to suggest otherwise. And two, the sentiment of solidarity is still noted and recognized even if it's imperfect. Scene 4, become opaque and imperceptible. The interesting thread through some of these vignettes is the undercurrent of how to become invisible in the surveillance of neoliberal fascism, AKA the Trump regime, and become visible as a site of resistance. There's been so much amazing work on the theory of what opacity and opaqueness means within our moment, including work by Zach Blass, Jacob Gabory, Edward Glissant, Liz Loesch, Wendy Chun, and others. Opacity might be thought of as an alternative to their familiar urging towards identification, visibility, and representation in feminist and queer politics and writing. Through various theorizations and practices of opacity in the face of demands for visibility politics and visualization software, the notion of how to become imperceptible in the filter of algorithmic data knowledge is an important way to theorize tactical refusion and subversion. Many of the projects that are called upon to demonstrate this theory of opacity do understand it as a relational tactic, available to some and not others in some moments and not other moments, with and through others through intertwined data, or literally through coalition building through workshops. I don't want to set up this notion of opacity as the false straw man for what I'm about to say. Scene 5, become ungovernable. Last year at ASA, Susan Stryker, American Studies Association Conference, for those who do not go, it's a really wonderful interdisciplinary conference where people from literary theory, cultural studies, women's studies, African American studies, religious studies, come together and give topics that are often like not visible, give papers on topics that are not really visible in a lot of our home fields. And they're some of the best panels ever. So if you have a chance to go to ASA, I really highly recommend it if you're liking the conversations here. Last year at ASA, Susan Stryker said, we need a, quote, we need 1,000 daily acts of resistance. If you see something small you can do it. Become ungovernable. I want to close by focusing on that note, what it means to become ungovernable. Given the strategies of how to become invisible to the surveillance state offered earlier, to become invisible, become imperceptible, develop strategies of opacity to counter the visualization techniques, what does it also mean to think about becoming ungovernable? It seems that the imperceptible is often about hiding the individual data in a sea of junk data. Hide the individuals at Standing Rock under a sea of junk data. Hide the individuals on the registry under junk registrants. This notion of imperceptibility is about making illegible the individual through overlapping data. But somehow this still reverts to the individual as both the salvation, the person providing their extra data for obfuscating the real data, as well as the object, aka the person needing to be hidden by extra data. In contrast, this notion of become ungovernable seems to have a politic of collective action that refuses to be seen as governable and recognizable as subjects. Stryker's notion of ungovernable includes the small action of resistance and more, not as imperfect responses, but as tiny moments of ungovernability. But that ungovernability has a sense of the collective response, the collective action, the collective desire that opacity itself doesn't have. It gives a name to the desire, ungovernance, and not the specific tactic. I take my cues from those who have built moments of collective action. After the election, Black Lives Matter issued one of their characteristically collective and movement-building calls. We are organizing to realize a world in which our faiths are held in esteem, our identities are respected, and our families are prioritized. We deserve a world in which our children are protected, our water is sacred, and where we are given a fair chance to decide our own fates. Because it is our duty to win, we will continue to fight. And like every day before it, we demand reparations, economic justice, a commitment to Black futures, and an end to the war on Black people in the United States and around the world. This is the important part. The work will be harder, but the work is the same. And the Standing Rock response, when the organizers put out the call for the digital check-in to confuse the geojacking algorithm. There's no solid line between, this is the quote from Standing Rock organizers, there's no solid line between organizers and others. This is a movement, not an organization. There are many camps and points of contact, and we can only verify that it did not originate from the Sacred Stone Camp Facebook page. We support the tactic and think it is a great way to express solidarity. Becoming ungovernable means becoming opaque to the techniques which are made to make us countable, invisible, and known. But it is also a means of becoming unrecognizable by the powers behind those techniques, a collective and political refusal of governance. I want us to be cognizant of the landmarks we are using to denotate the projects here and the projects in digital humanities writ large, and the boundaries and goals of these projects, and to be cognizant of the landmarks that others are using to codify our own projects too. We are in the middle of a regime in which data, bodies, people, and justifications have even bigger consequences. And I hope we can pay attention not only to the unruly data, but also to the unruly people, unquantifiable sentiments, and the ungovernable collective. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Kelly Moore, and after Kelly's presentation, Professor Moore's presentation, we will open it up for questions. I'm sure you have many. Professor Moore examines the role of media technology in the production of legal and political knowledge. Her ethnographic research on courtroom mediation examines the role of the image in facilitating the performance of witness testimony in domestic violence cases. She's writing a monograph that draws on Black feminist thought, legal philosophy, and visual culture to analyze courtroom rhetorical practices, haptic customs within ongoing debates about the drama and helplessness, facilitated communication, feminist jurisprudence, visual literacy, post-racial embodiment, and digitality. These debates form the basis of her second project, a study of the contribution of post-war Black feminist literary criticism to contemporary media theory. Before joining MCC, Kelly earned her PhD in communication at the University of California, San Diego, and she's also an alumna of the University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Moore.
Thank you so much. I'd like to echo a very warm thank you to Liz and student volunteers and other colleagues for putting on this really wonderful and somehow actually relaxing event also. I've been really stressed out and I feel a lot calmer after spending a few nights here in the quiet. And so I'll just quickly get into it. I'm going to contextualize my paper, which is highly theoretical at the beginning, with by thinking about a couple of, or some themes that have been uttered in I think, every paper so far. And that has to do with the way in which the digital humanities, to the extent that DH and its platforms and activities are part of civil society, the presenters here have pointed out a number of old bad things that we continue to see. The erasure of race, sexuality, and class in the archive, the rehearsal of physical and psychic violence online or other sorts of electronic platforms, the obsession over form, and the way that we analyze that, and the often sort of Eurocentric theories that we use to do that. What I want to suggest in this paper is that what's happening here is that we are in a way articulating a pessimism or the pessimism of digital humanities. And my paper is going to consider this question of pessimism as it is appearing in two philosophical movements that are really having quite a moment right now, Afro-pessimism and something called non-standard philosophy, which is coming out of French theory. And what I'm gonna do in this paper is think about those two philosophical approaches that, like I said, are having a moment, and present the way that those two approaches offer an understanding of the digital that is a little bit different than is being articulated in the conference so far, but also that I think will remain familiar. And at the end, I'm going to offer, I'm going to sort of move away from that kind of theory and move away to something more, sort of interesting and maybe fun by offering a reading of hashtag activity. Okay. And also what I'm going to do is think about the place of Black feminist thought within Afro-pessimism and non-standard philosophy and talk about what I think is happening there. The composition of the dark feminine and Black maternity is the subject of this talk that responds to Denise De Silva's call for a Black feminist poetics that would rearrange some of the normal routines of Black feminist intellectuals. Black feminist thought has developed intersectional reading practices that demonstrate how institutions, particularly law, fail to recognize being Black and female simultaneously. Its normal routines analyze injury, rehearsed in the representation of Black women and the community at large, offering what Jennifer Nash calls protected readings of representation. Black feminist intellectuals articulate Black personhood through a preoccupation with representing the metaphor of the hold, and the risk to freedom, kinship, and corporeal integrity entailed therein. Whether the barracoon, slave ship, prison, laboratory, plantation, hidden garret, master's house, or camp, the hold speaks to the kinds of risk shaping Black life and morbidity. The confining space of the hold, a whole, is the definitive site of risk that Black feminist intellectuals use to conceptualize Blackness as matter that accrues to the person. In this tradition, Black matter is the sediment of slave law, slavery's afterlife. In the confined violence of the hold, black matter and the idea of a black mater are indistinguishable. Out of the normal routines of black feminist thought is Afro-pessimism, a radical philosophical outlook that goes a step further to dismiss the coalitional politics of civil society in favor of dwelling the problem of blackness as that being who secures democracy through the hold, a thing structurally bent toward premature death and dispossession. Jared Sexton, a proponent of, and I'm going to call that AP, a proponent of AP, locates its sustained analysis and mediation on anti-blackness in black feminist intellectual traditions. Afro-pessimism's major subversion, it seems to me, is to shrug its shoulders at the political promise of civil society, its democratic associations, and reform-based strategies of coalition. From this position, AP is able to theorize the commons pessimistically in terms of anti-blackness. Afro-pessimism grows out of the lessons of intersectionality to suggest that anti-blackness cannot be resolved through legal reform, more positive images of black people in the commons, or the election of the first black president, Barack Obama. Anti-blackness is a brute philosophical decision, a form of racist solidarity that structures thought itself, the pleasure principle, and the idea and use of common space according to the fungible status of the black person. This essay affirms black feminist relations to Afro-pessimism and mines black feminist authors' contribution to the pessimism of philosophy. In another academic enclave of predominantly Eurocentric male academics, they are credited with developing non-standard philosophy, which I'll refer to as NSP, an emerging critique of Western philosophical tradition that also recognizes the pessimism of philosophy. NSP radically intervenes in the status of the commons by developing the concept of the generic. Proponents of NSP describe social media interfaces, networks, and their protocols of control in flat, unhuman terms. Their explanation of network operational structures is valuable to Black studies for what it does and does not say about the relationship between black matter, the unhuman, and personhood. Non-standard philosophy invests possibility in the inhuman for thinking about an increasingly unthinkable world. Through Black feminist intellectual traditions, AP inverts this relation, describing the structure of the commons, including social media, from the position of what happens to Black people in it. The commons is a hold always in relation to Blackness and the afterlives of slave law that conditions Black social life and death in the contemporary. NSP details the universal material substrates of media forms, while AP achieves a universal or seemingly universal position through the representation of the Black body and narratives of the flesh. These are two strategies resulting in different priorities of concern, I argue. There are moments of affinity and tension between AP and NSP. Two patterns emerge. First, among AP intellectuals, Black male scholars conscientiously disclose AP's links to Black feminist intellectual traditions, while also thinking critically about other forms of kinship they share with Black women in the commons, including private domestic spheres. Second, NSP proponents acknowledge the affinities between AP and NSP in articles, graduate-level classrooms, and international conferences, with little reference to Black feminist intellectuals. The particular activism of Black women is especially alighted. I write from a concern that the scholarship and activism of Black feminist intellectuals will be ignored in favor of ascendant AP. Ascendant AP and NSP discourses risk becoming a conversation between elite male academics and their Eurocentric fathers. Thanks. Thank you. It's the tenderness. The following discussion triangulates between AP and NSP, arguing that emerging discourses demand Black feminist triangulation in order to deepen and advance the project of ending the world as we know it, by emphasizing the pessimism of Western philosophy. Black Lives Matter hashtag activism is an organizing example of the following discussion of affinities and tensions between AP and NSP. By reading the compositional aesthetics of BLM hashtags, If They Gun Me Down and My Black Father, which is a smaller one, I suggest that the different priorities and stakes of NSP and AP ultimately gesturing toward greater collaboration and increased collegiality between proponents of both, who invaginate Black feminist intellectual traditions. The affinities between Black feminist thought and NSP would enact a revolutionary ethics and politics if the generic is a concept over whose participating enclaves we can struggle together. Black women's social media activism transfigures life and death struggles from street to virtual interfaces. Black Lives Matter began as a Black feminist maternal enunciation that linked the state murder of Black men to the systemic disruption of Black reproductive patterns and possibilities by, quote, reframing the matter of anti-Black police violence as an element of the productive oppression of Black women, end quote. BLM hashtags engage Black radical compositional aesthetics to redress the sexual violence of slavery and lynching of Black men that systematically disrupts contemporary Black reproductive patterns and possibilities of being and becoming. BLM hashtags present how Black people live and die as Black people. In doing so, they offer a generic view of Blackness that resonates with concepts from NSP and AP. Black Lives Matter hashtag activism is an ars vita that Jared Sexton argues emerges, quote, within a global catastrophe so total that the creation of production of Black poetry, Black art, a stylization of the Black body, a Black sense of place cannot but be invented wholesale, end quote. This essay contends that BLM hashtags, If They Gun Me Down and My Black Father, make available the generic victim as a cornerstone of humanity and do so in a way that demonstrates the example of Black feminist poetics, while developing Affinity's intentions with NSP writing on art and aesthetics, gaining ground in academic discourse. The Affinity's intentions between Black feminist poetics and NSP turn on the relationship between risk and art production. Art historian Suzanne Preston Bleer suggests, quote, art's similarly diverse and often competing reference are sharpened in contexts of risk, invigorated, polished, and thrust into the public to be renegotiated, redefined, and created anew, end quote. For Bleer, the relationship between risk and creativity moves, quote, artists and patrons into thinking about materials, techniques, and art forms in striking new ways. Risk, rather than being detrimental to artistic creativity, encourages new levels of technical and aesthetic brilliance, end quote. Risk, creativity, and art concern multiple possibilities where being is oriented toward becoming and a, quote, dynamic of risk engagement via personal skills, wisdom, and character. How am I doing on time?
You have, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Proponents and principles of NSP are discussed. Okay, I'm going to skip that part. Okay, the section's called In Tandem in Tension with Black Feminist Theory and Theories of Non-Philosophy, Non-Standard Philosophy. Standard philosophy addresses itself to the idea of being. It describes being, however, as it describes being, however, only a double appears, a binary thinking that characterizes Western thought. Against this position, proponents of non-standard philosophy describe being as one. For NSP's intellectuals, when standard philosophy inquires into the nature of being, the result is a splitting of the concept of being from one into two. A descriptor of being is offered, but we do not come to an understanding of being as such. Non-standard philosophy uses the terms sufficiency and insufficiency, underdetermined and overdetermined, to describe the problem resulting from the binary ordering of the world. The world is undifferentiated, insufficient to itself prior to the decision standard philosophy makes to categorize being. The world is a scene, a one of multiple possibilities. Sufficiency, perhaps counterintuitively, suggests being is limited and circumscribed. Interestingly, it is the sufficiency of standard philosophical reason that lends to overdetermination of being. The bitter cold Frantz Fanon feels upon being loudly hailed as a Negro, as it is an example of the philosophical decision that accords no status to black flesh, thereby overdetermining black skin with negative meaning. Against this view, NSP's generic aesthetics is oriented toward the promotion of insufficiency. The generic is oriented toward an idea of being that is underdetermined, insufficient to itself, open. Non-standard philosophy offers a way of thinking about aesthetics where humanity is understood generically. The idea of the generic, quote, a characteristic, and this is a quote from Alex Galloway, a characteristic of relating to a class or type of objects, phenomena, etc., applicable to a large group or class or any member of it, not specific or general. Sorry, that's from the dictionary. That's just what the generic means. So the generic is non-absolute and underdetermined in its capacities and differences. Unlike generic humanity, which is underdetermined, State forms of power like police surveillance make overdetermined readings of the black body. The negative overdetermination of black bodies in the street leads to the overrepresentation of black morbidity, biological death, and social death, for example. Non-standard philosophy's major proponent, Francois Laruelle, suggests the cornerstone of humanity is the victim, not the executioner or police. The non-standard philosopher ought to relate to the victim in a way that acknowledges and assists in the critical resurrection of the victim, rather than her conversion to a productive normal citizen. Typically, however, intellectuals, quote, endorse a kind of division of labor between victims and intellectuals, where one party does the labor of suffering while the other party carries the burden of doing the television reporting about it, or even the DH reporting about it. There is a tension here in terms of how black feminist intellectuals might consider the violence of the hold, not in terms of a simplistic division of labor into clean categories of sufferers and advocates, but as necessary for non-standard thinking. Proponents of NSP seem reluctant to participate in collapsing the sufferer-advocate division. This idea is borne out in NSP's pivot away from the human to the unhuman and descriptions of black matter. It might be interesting here to think about Christina Sharp's very personal introduction to her book, Wake Work, where she talks about the death of her brother and family members, right? It's not often that we have such a deep personal discussion in the books that we publish. Over 20 years ago, Toni Morrison detailed how the Africanist presence in American literature polices matters of, quote, class, sexual license, and repression, formations and exercises of power, and mediations on ethics and accountability, end quote. In Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, Morrison was interested in the dismissal of the critical examination of blackness among white literary critics and authors. To the extent that networks were previously hidden forms of knowledge, they achieve coherence through Morrison's concept of playing in the dark. This maneuver becomes apparent at the end of The Exploit, where Galloway and Thacker abandon the very description of electronic networks they spend many pages formulating in terms of pure material substrates. They write, and this is kind of a long quote, networks involved a shift in scale, one in which the cultural concern is no longer the action of the individuated agents or nodes in the network. What matters more and more is the very distribution and dispersal of action throughout the network. A dispersal would ask us to define networks in terms other than the entire overly spatialized dichotomy of nodes and edges together. In a sense, therefore, our understanding of networks is all too human, end quote. A tension in the author's network description is that it may be actually all too white, as Sylvia Wynter and others have pointed out that the human, in standard reason, is more accurately a particular ethnoclass or genre of the human being, using the degradation of blackness to sustain whiteness as humanity. Black folks' morbidity pervades all of NSP examples, I'm arguing, without being acknowledged as such. In describing the network as pure form, Galloway and Thacker may enact a writing as the imperial and colonial practice Morrison equates to playing in the dark. This is my concern. The authors, I think, miss an opportunity to articulate the racial underpinning behind the viral pathogens, mob violence, furious swarms they use to illustrate how networks operate as non-liberating theaters of oppression. Okay, so I'm just going to move then, and I developed some other examples here, but I'm going to get to compositional aesthetics. The word hashtag enjoys a remarkable slant rhyme with the Yoruba African principle ashe, so hashtag ashe, meaning alternately, so be it, may it come to pass, and shrine. In practice, ashe refers to an authorial principle of composition through which change is possible. When the hashtag, whose dominant signification refers to an objective marker that identifies online groups or topics of interest, is read in the break for ashe, the hashtag slants toward an assertion of black being in social media interfaces. Margaret Druhl and Henry John Druhl helped migrate this principle to U.S. theater and performance studies in the early 1970s by carefully citing Nigerian scholars of Yoruba poetics. Quoting Raymond Prince, they characterized the principle in the following way. To utter the name of something, may draw that something into actual practice, not only within the mind and body of he who utters and he who hears the word, but also in the physical word as well, end quote. BLM hashtags articulated Blackness as generic humanity, making manifest in ethics and politics of risk and creation that the compositional aesthetic principles of Ashe were conceived for the individual to enact. The hashtag activism of If They Gun Me Down and My Black Father opens a larger question about the risk of composing the Black voice and being. Ashe is a generative force in the mode of Black feminist critique important to theorizing the relationship between Black expression and the discourse of the digital, though largely unacknowledged and infrequently represented as such in academic discourse. Academic and non-academic Black women are at the forefront of ontological thinking about digital environments in terms of space, time, risking themselves online and offline within an anti-Black world. The aim in the following discussion, then, is to demonstrate what Jessica Marie Johnson calls, quote, Black feminist synchronicity, which is a form of Black poetic composition whose enunciation slants the hashtag from mere group marking or topic to a theoretical position favoring compositional principles of Ashe that manifest Black presence in network interface. And I'm going to sort of begin to conclude here. The transcultural resonance of Yoruba compositional aesthetics is sourced in the words and social media activity of three Black feminist women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who in 2013 acted as computational machines by creating Black Lives Matter after George Zimmerman was acquitted of murdering teenager Trayvon Martin. Yoruba philosophy and poetics are practiced in southwest Nigeria, the Americas, the Mediterranean, and it is significant that Opal Tometi, a Nigerian-American writer and activist, played a direct role in setting up the Tumblr and Twitter accounts, eventually shaping BLM interfaces. Ashe sources its metaphysical contemplation and composition of being and the power of words like those exchanged by Garza, Cullors, and Tometi. The concept takes the special languages of prayer and invocation and in a double movement enshrines them in an interface. Ashe is fundamental to Yoruba poetics and is performed in song, sculpture, textiles, scarification patterns, and medicine. Phonemic awareness of the slant rhyme between hashtag and Ashe, Black Matter and Black Mater, should draw our attention to the slippages and breaks between concepts. Slant rhyme, also known as half, near, oblique, off, weak, imperfect, lazy rhyme, is marked by its definitional deficiency in relation to perfect rhyme, true rhyme. One way to appreciate slant rhyme is that rhyme is as rhyme in black in the break. Attending to the pleasure of phonemic awareness is a commitment to the necessary compositional crime of Black rhyme. In the case of Black Lives Matter, Ashe compositional protocols break, transfigure, and slant between street and digital interfaces. The BLM hashtag is a bioelectric song whose Ashe was powerful enough to socially organize and threaten enemies online while also gathering people in physical geographies. And I can stop.
So
We can,
have time for discussion.
yeah, I could, yeah, I'll stop there. But I'll just end my paper by saying Ashe. Thank you.
I'd like to just open it up for discussion. I think we have a few minutes to discuss and ask questions. I see a question over here.
Testing.
Thank you to three fantastic presentations. And I actually have a question and then a question / concern. And you kind of answered my question while you were closing, because I was wondering were you going to get to the point of the overlap between the ways in which digitally things could spread, move, etc., and how Ashe also spreads and moves. And you kind of talked about that with your closing. So that question was formulating, and I don't know if you want to say any more, but and then back to the first two presentations, which were dope. My question is, so in my research, I'm very concerned with the ethical treatment of Black folks who are dead. And what I mean by that, and historians probably get mad at me for this question, but I really feel uncomfortable with how we talk about dead Black folk. And more importantly, for example, it seems like if they're dead, we can write about, say about, do whatever we want to about them. And then in your examples, when we thinking about this, like this 3D technology, and you already raised some ethical decisions that goes along with how we rebroadcast particular spaces. But even like with the ungovernability and like this notion of invisibility, which is a little bit separate, but it all comes together. And my question is this: what ethical concerns do we bring up when dealing with digitally Black dead folks? Like for particularly, even with your work with Bartman. Like Bartman is probably, unfortunately, she's been through the worst of this whole thing, from Cuvier's, this from her being disembodied, literally removing her vagina, and like all this stuff that's already happened to her. And descendants of these dead folks are still alive, right? So there are communities of people who are affected. Even with an earlier slide of the gentleman who was killed in 1989, like his family members are still alive. So these are ethical issues. Not only do they address the past, but also present day communities of these people, of these African diasporic people who are still alive. So I'm guessing my question is, so the second part of my question is, what ethical either self-positioning, or how do we deal with how we treating Black dead folks? Because my argument is, okay, like in anthropology, for example, you have to go through an RB proposal, you have to submit an RB proposal to deal with real live human subjects, but it doesn't seem like there's anything there in place to prevent, especially in this world we live in today with the scholars that are out there today. There's nothing to prevent someone from saying, okay, I'm gonna take these steps and then perpetuate white supremacy even further.
Okay. I do, that is precisely the connection I'm trying to make between viral media and this concept of ashe, as well as suggest that we need to vary our citational practice. And I understand that, you know, there's a way in which I'm talking about a community of academics, highly educated, highly privileged, right? But nevertheless, I think that we do have an important kind of work to do amongst ourselves in terms of reading each other's work and responding to it, going to each other's conferences and finding yourself in a conference or reading a book that you might not traditionally read. And the concept of ashe for me, I find very generative, because for me, it's a way of talking about becoming in an Africanist key. And so I don't have to turn to Deleuze all the time, right? So again, varying citational practice. And then to get to your question about how ashe and maybe viral media or the spreading and notion of becoming happens, I really see that in Angel's examples of the 3D imaging, because again, ashe refers to this idea of letting something come to be and enshrinement. And I think that that is happening in an ethical sense as he does this very interesting, very creative work to talk about the kinds of architectures that were built to house and contain Black bodies, and then sort of generate a notion of white humanity off of that. So I saw that quite a lot in Professor Nieves' really nice talk.
Other questions?
I think Angel.
Yeah, there's a second one.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, you raise a really important question, I think, in the work of historians. And I think for the most part, historians haven't done a very good job of discussing that work in particular, how they actually engage with those who are no longer living and the history or the lived experiences of those who are no longer living. I should say that in my own sort of feminist practice, it's really important for me to connect with family members and to work through a process that allows them to be the decision makers in what's actually getting told, what's getting recorded, and how that information is getting disseminated. So you might actually see in a lot of the work that I've put out there a very careful scripting on my part of not trying to reveal information at all that has not been vetted or really shared with descendants even of folks that I may be talking about their deceased family members. So I think it's something we have to be better about in our practice, but it isn't necessarily something that historians have a kind of ethical practice guidelines. And I think we can talk reams and reams about how IRB in itself is very problematical as a process and the kinds of violence that it has committed against particularly communities of color. So I think it's a live issue, and I think it's something that we're starting to see emerge in DH practice, particularly around the ethics of how do we talk about Black, brown, queer, and other kinds of bodies at conferences. So we're beginning to see diversity and inclusion statements that are trying to do that. And I think we're on the path to doing that, but we're not quite there yet. But I think it's a clarion call that you've given us to really begin to find a way to do that in much better ways.
It's a huge question. Immediately what comes to mind is when I arrived at Duke Literature, which is was founded by Fred Jameson. So there's an English department, which is sort of the traditional English type literature. If you study books, you go to English there. And the lit program is more like cultural studies and critical theory, blah, blah, blah. So when I arrived there, we had 0 categories of classes to fulfill. So people were graduating in Duke Lit with 0 classes on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc. They basically were taking classes with Fred Jameson and Michael Hart and Michael Hart, you know. So it was like theory boys. And so part of what some of us did in my cohort was actually institute a matrix of classes that students have to fulfill before graduating with a PhD. Because if you're going to go on the market as a cultural studies person, I feel like it's ethical to have training in how to do that properly. And I feel like that is it's like not an answer at all to your question, but it's sort of, it's like this stuff goes so back, right? Like it goes so far back. It's like all of us up here, what do we do? What kind of images do I choose to show or not show when I'm talking about my Bartman work, right? Like, I mean, part of what I did was I found her original autopsy report and translated it. And, you know, there's a lot in there that is damaging in terms of constituting a certain kind of vision of things, right, without proper contextualization. And I don't know if I have proper contextualization in 15 minutes in a public space, right? Like I have to really think about that. And so the question is, you know, how do people up here or in the classroom deal with these ethical questions? But it goes so far back. And I think one of the things is really to keep. One of the things I feel like I am good at and honing in on is calling into question the ways in which we as researchers are constituted to replicate these things that we study. And if we can't change that, we're screwed. And that is the thing that I am like, a squeaky wheel on. And it takes a lot of people to change these things in the institution. Of course, this is like the question of the broader culture out there as well. But within the academy, there's a lot of work to be done, and it requires people to stand up and actually do it. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting that you would ask the question that you asked, Travis, because this might seem a little digressive, But from a literary standpoint, I thought first about Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, where he had this group of people the Mutafikas, whose job was to recover stolen artifacts. That's one of the things they did. And so from a literary perspective, he's theorizing about taking back. Yeah. And I thought also, just when you started talking about Sarah Bartman, about Toni Morrison's character, Setha, who carries the body around until she can honor the body, even though she doesn't know that she carries her own father's bones. She wants to honor the body by taking in the body back and burying the body. So just from the anthropological perspective and from the perspective of the archive, you know, what's in that archive? How did it get there? You know, and just from listening to Angel Nieves, the way he talked about the three-dimensional archive, you know, and the implications of that. So this has been very, I've learned a lot sitting here. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm Amanda Castro from Stevenson University in Baltimore, and as a part of our very interdisciplinary virtual reality initiative, we're having students create VR experiences that are both educational and evoke empathy. So my question is, how can I encourage these very powerful, captivating ideas that the students have while guiding them away from the appropriation, colonization, and as Rupsi put it, Columbusing of these messy political spaces, especially when we're talking about the city of Baltimore?
Angel should take that one.
Yeah, great question. You know, one of the things I think we have to be cognizant of, particularly when we're working with our students, is to make sure that they understand their own positionality in relationship to the kinds of stories and narratives that we're trying to tell them about, but also to remind them that there's great privilege in being in an institution of higher education, and that with that sort of privilege comes a certain kind of responsibility. And we really do need to make sure that they understand where they come from and how the stories impact them or relate to them. I think if we did a better job of having our students understand how it relates to their own experiences, then we can really get them to be much better about that sort of empathy that we want them to really embrace and feel. But unless we're able to really get them to connect to the narratives or the stories, and particularly in such a complicated city as Baltimore, it remains sort of at a distance from them. So I'm not sure how to do it. I've tried a number of different things in the classroom, but some of it is, and you know, I sort of front load classes these days with talking about power, privilege, and access all the time, and making sure that we return to those sort of three things almost on a weekly basis to make sure people understand that power manifests in so many different kinds of ways, both big P and little p power, that we just need to have our students be more reflective about that.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but you can talk to our panelists after this is over. Thank you.
And thanks to the generosity of the Omohundro Institute, remember, we will have this nice long reception with food and drink actually at it. I shouldn't sound excited about that. But knowing university rules about serving alcohol, I think, you know, that does require a certain amount of wonder. You did it. No, 100 did it. So I'd like to just thank Hermine for the wonderful curation of this conversation that she did. And let's take a brief break and then reconvene at 3:15 for American Studies and the Digital Humanities. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Together, I know. Wasn't able to attend the last meeting, and I don't know if you were there, but you heard me trying to get on. And so that's my next step, is to try to get people for my for my panel. I will be putting out a call pretty soon, and I guess I have to get the exact dates of that thing.
Of the symposium?
Yeah. March 16th and 17th. Okay, I'll do that. Thank you for reminding me. Pleasure meeting.
I didn't mean to. I just wanted to.
Well, I'm glad to know, because we're doing this thing digitally, which is quite appropriate for the conference we're in, and we're not succeeding on some levels of communicating. Thank you.
It'll be exciting for you to go through those other spots.
we're working on the hookup. And is sitting fine for you? Is sitting fine? You don't need to. Hi. How are you? Hannah Rosen. You worked with me with my class 2 years ago. I've been meaning to get in touch ever since. I was on leave all last year, so not quite 2 years, a year and a semester. So we have separate laptops that people would like to hook up for their presentation.
Sure. Are they all going to be separate?
I believe so. They're going to be together, and Amanda is going to be separate.
But I mean, are we going to be separate computers each time? We don't want to hook up more than one computer at a time to the displays. Or do you want to see?
Oh yes, one at a time.
Okay. Because we are possible to hook up 4 and have the screen split like that.
That was an option.
Yeah.
We can really confuse the audience. Do all 4 at the same time.
Sound? Is there any?
It's just web browser, just show screen. Yeah, no sound.
Okay. The podium that we use to do this is actually in the closet. The other way we can do is we can hook up, and we're going to have to use. Is there only 2 laptops in?
It looks that way.
Okay. We have a wireless display system where we can get you to hook up to the unit on its own. But what I need you to do is download the app, and I can get that up so you can see where you need to go. It can. Well, okay, so the way the screen is working.
I don't see that.
You don't see it, Jeff? I'm going to see if I can route it. Actually, I can't do that. So we might have to do those. We try, we're going to have to try the other way so they can hear it, but it can't go anywhere in the screen. They can see it. So we're going to have to do this. Can I give you
I'll be standing up there, but yeah. Yeah. I knew what I'm doing.
I'm doing over there too, but like literally at the side of my body where you're picking your body eventually. Just, you know, right. Like feeling the holistic panel.
Go ahead and
Great.
just put it on there, and then I'll put it on there.
I should be ready to go.
Okay.
Okay, everyone. Welcome back. It's time for us to get started, please. Is it working? It wasn't working before. This one too. Oh, this one too. Hello? Turn it on. This one's on? Okay. Everybody, please, welcome back. It's time for us to be started. I'm sorry we're starting a little bit late. We had some technology to work out. Welcome. This is the next session of the symposium is going to focus on the intersection of American Studies and digital humanities. I'm Hannah Rosen. I teach here at William & Mary in American Studies and also in history. And we have three wonderful guests here joining us on the panel. They're each going to share some thoughts and then open it up for somewhat of a roundtable amongst them and with the audience. To maintain the flow of the discussion, I'm going to introduce the panelists now, all three in the order that they will speak, and then they will take the floor when they are ready to share their comments, okay? It is wonderful today to be joined by Amanda Phillips, who's an assistant professor of English and Film and Media Studies at Georgetown University, and also co-chair of the Digital Humanities Caucus of the American Studies Association, co-chair with Lauren Tilton, who is also here on the panel. Professor Phillips' work brings queer, feminist, and critical race theory together with game and software studies with the objective of, and I think I'm quoting Professor Phillips from the web, the objective of, quote, understanding how difference is produced and policed in technological interfaces. She's published her work in queer game studies, games and culture, digital creativity, and debates in the digital humanities. It is equally terrific that we are joined by Lauren Tilton. who's coming from the University of Richmond, where she's an assistant professor of digital humanities in the Department of Rhetoric and Communication Studies. As I said a moment ago, Professor Tilton is co-chairing with Professor Phillips the ASA's Digital Humanities Caucus. Professor Tilton's research examines the politics of representation in U.S. history and culture, and she's currently investigating collaborative community-based media historically, focusing on the 1960s and 70s, through her project entitled Participatory Media, which is funded by an NEH Digital Projects for the Public grant. Lastly, Professor Tilton is also co-director of Photogrammar, an interactive web-based platform for New Deal and World War II photography. And finally, we are very lucky that Marissa Parham is here, who's a professor of English at Amherst College. Professor Parham works at the intersection of a variety of fields, including African American literary studies and film and media studies. And she also directs the Immersive Reality Lab for the Humanities, a collective exploring experimental humanistic inquiry in the digital realm. She's the author of Haunting and Displacement in African American Literature and Culture, as well as the African American Student's Guide to College. At Amherst, she's a faculty diversity and inclusion officer, and she has also expended much professional effort challenging racial bias and exclusion within the digital humanities. Please join me in welcoming our guests, and then they will speak in the order they were just introduced.
Thank you very much. I need a microphone. I'm very sensitive to the mic problem. I used to be a projectionist when I was in college. Okay, so thank you so much for the introductions. And again, I will join everyone in thanking Liz for holding this event and bringing together all of these people who have been influential in my work. And of course, it's a pleasure just to get to talk to everyone in person again. I wanted to mark, as I begin, this sort of phenomenon that's been happening behind the scenes, so it might not be apparent to everyone, of these panels kind of changing and shifting forms from roundtable to paper panel, and in our case, from paper panel back to roundtable. I think this is really great, and I think it kind of goes along with the spirit of what a lot of us sort of transformed DHers and queer OS folks and stuff do to just kind of like challenge the systems that we're given and say like, actually what we need right now is X sort of thing to happen. So this is sort of in the spirit of that. And what we're gonna do here is kind of introduce a lot of sort of institutional correlations between American studies, particularly through the American Studies Association, because that's what a lot of us are very intimately connected to. But we'd also kind of invite the audience to join us in conversation and reflecting about like the amazing things that we've seen today and how they sort of connect to student projects, to our position as digital humanists and Americanists and critical race scholars and like all of our different disciplines sort of coming together and how that's confusing and difficult in a lot of ways. So I want to talk, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction about the Digital Humanities Caucus and my sort of side project that I've been doing in reconstructing kind of a history of digital humanities through ASA. I'm not a historian, and I'm also not an Americanist technically, sort of by training. I know we've sort of ridiculed that phrase a lot at this conference, but yes, I'm not an Americanist by training, nor a historian, but I'm going to do a history of American studies a little bit right now. Some of the things that the DH Caucus has ongoing right now in terms of our service work to these fields include a working group that is creating recommendations for tenure and promotion in American studies. We have a working group that is looking at precarious labor in the digital humanities and trying to create some sort of position statement. It's not 100% clear what our sort of intervention is going to be yet, but we're looking at the phenomenon right now. We have been fortunate to be working directly with American Quarterly to institute to help them choose digital projects editors after a sort of controversy erupted over the way that they sort of rolled out that program. Every year we create an ASA digital panels list that is just that, a list of panels at ASA that are dealing with digital culture, technologies, in the very, very broad sort of sense that Jessica put out all the different categories of digital things, digital scholarship. We also have DH Caucus-sponsored panels and the Digital Shorts program, which I highly encourage everyone here, if you're going to be at ASA this year, sign up for the Digital Shorts, 2 to 3 minutes of showcasing your work to a group of scholars who are mostly working in American Studies and are interested in the digital. The thing that I left off this list is our consultations. So the caucus actually consults with people at ASA to help them get digital projects started up. So folks who are perhaps unsure whether they belong in digital humanities, one of the things we've tried to do is use our platform from within this conference space to bring more people in to the fold and sort of give them whatever guidance and suggestions and recommendations that they need. This is a picture that I stole from Fiona's Facebook page of our Digital Humanities Caucus meeting, I think 2 years ago. And one of the reasons I want to show this, and one of the reasons that Fiona posted it on Facebook in the first place, is that we have a very diverse crew. And I don't say that to invoke this sort of like feel-good identity politics, but as a way of marking the fact that this happened organically, and this is a reflection of ASA, much more than the digital humanities. And so those of us who were already in ASA working on digital things kind of came together, and this is what we look like, and this is what our DH looks like. So I wanted to sort of share that with you as a sort of phenomenon that happens. Now, why does this happen within American Studies, or what is this really productive juncture between the digital humanities and American Studies? And this ties into that historical project that I have sort of alluded to, that I'm doing as part of our working group on precarious labor, trying to figure out what has been the relationship between the digital humanities and American Studies generally. Part of this confluence happens because of the sort of social infrastructures that were in place in American Studies that was already a very transnational sort of discipline before the digital created or made more obvious what transnational connections look like. Part of this is technological, and I will say that one of the things that we don't often realize, and I was having a conversation at lunch about this, is that the American Studies Association was one of the first big academic associations to have not just a website, but a sort of online social network. So this is the American Crossroads Project, and I have the good fortune of being at Georgetown University where that was hosted, and the people responsible for that are still there. This was something that, again, not as an Americanist, but coming sort of from an English discipline, digital humanities training, I was completely unaware that American Studies was already very digital before, and sort of from the beginning. So the Crossroads Project actually began somewhere in the mid-90s. I've seen dates from 1993 to 1995. I haven't pinned Randy down for like the exact moment when the website was launched. And by comparison, and please people in the room who are more familiar with this, feel free to correct me. The earliest webpage I could find for the MLA was from like 98, right? And MLA is one of the sites that we generally think of as more generative of DH work. But Crossroads was happening first. There's also a really interesting issue of American Quarterly that was on hypertext scholarship in American Studies. Now this is in 1998, and it represents the kind of wide-ranging sort of work in DH that doesn't engage much with the sort of like ultra techie side of DH that some people critique. And this is sort of DH scholarship that we're pushing to be more widely recognized now, but happening at a very early point in a sort of scholarly history. And so I think American Studies, and American Quarterly in particular as a publication who did this, and when I sort of uncovered this issue, again, not being familiar with it before, I was really baffled by the way that the digital projects section was sort of presented as this new thing, or like this experimental thing that they were trying, when this was already a thing that was happening. So, why American Studies? Because American Studies has actually been doing this kind of work from very early times. The last sort of artifact that I want to show is this is a white paper from 2015 that George Lipsitz wrote on what is American Studies, and I just want to read this quote and let it kind of sink in and how it feels for everyone here. So the work of American Studies takes place on campuses and in communities in many different realms of scholarship and civic life, inside and outside the juridical and geographic boundaries of the nation state. It transpires through the activities of the American Studies Association, which has more than 5,000 members, in articles published in the key journals of the field, in the teaching, research, and community service commitments of American Studies departments and programs, in the migration of American Studies perspectives, frames, ideas, evidence, and arguments across the humanities and the social sciences, and in equity-oriented collaborative partnerships between campus and community groups. This capacious and sometimes even ungainly configuration enables different kinds of work to be done in different ways at different kinds of institutions. No one pattern prevails, in part because American Studies departments have emerged out of a complex array of local initiatives and innovations, opportunities and obstacles, agreements and antagonisms. I feel like we could swap American Studies here for digital humanities, and it would mean almost, or read almost the exact same way. And so I think there's a certain resonance with the disciplines, and in some ways this is true of all interdisciplines, right? We're all looking for these particular sites, and we're just kind of like doing what we're doing and coalesce around each other in different ways. But there's a way in which American Studies, and the American Studies Association in particular, was able to foster what became Transform DH, for example, was born at American Studies. The DH caucus predates Transform DH and had this really interesting history of the caucus system within the American Studies Association was ostensibly there to incubate new fields. But through various interviews that I've been performing, it's also very clear that it was there to protect the sort of traditional fields of American Studies from the invasion of trendy things like critical race studies and feminist studies and that kind of thing, right? So I think this is an interesting structure of that institution that enables good and bad things that I would like to talk about with lots of people. I remember when we were starting Transform DH in its infancy, a very high-profile feminist media scholar, one of our earliest supporters, told us, you know, this is the place to be doing it because it's going to be a lot easier to get ASA to care about digital humanities than it will be to get digital humanities to care about social justice and like the things that you're interested in. And that points not only towards the individual mentors within ASA that helped incubate a lot of scholars that you see here today in digital humanities and in this other sort of like broader digital humanities that we're trying to promote. But, you know, that's kind of the way our disciplines grow, right? You might have one or two like very key people who influence a particular generation to kind of like go out there and do things. So these are going to be my provocations for our conversation today, and I'll let Lauren speak in more detail about particularly AQ's role in all of this.
Thank you. Again, I'll sing the praises of Liz and the William and Mary crew and all the labor and people it took to make this happen. So thank you so much. This is no small feat, and thank you for creating such an amazing space. It's wonderful. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about ASA and DH as well, building off of what Amanda has already said. So one of the things that we have been trying to think about as we've particularly come into leadership in the ASA and the DH caucus is to think about how our institutional structures can address but also replicate the kinds of inequalities that our very field tries to problematize. So actually that the ASA can be complicit in its very logics that it critiques and critiques and critiques over and brings really important, but how can we within a caucus make those issues visible and then transform from within as well? And one of those has been one of the reasons the DH caucus came into formation was because this kind of scholarship was not also in the conference itself. It was rarely acknowledged in the kind of panels that were being held, and the kind of, except for the special issue in AQ, right? Very little work that reflected the kind of digital humanities that we've been hearing about today and have been seeing over the last 10 years, 15, 20 years. And so, and that was important because what the national conference includes signals what kind of scholarship matters to the field and what will be accepted and what will count and how it will count. And so how could we actually begin to think about that in really structural ways? And so what we started to think, these come into questions about what is acceptable knowledge production, in other words, what counts. Can we actually then think about, right, a lot of it, more American Studies work thinks about problematized visual culture, material culture, digital culture. How can we actually think about form of scholarship in new ways? How can we think about representing scholarship beyond text in the manuscript? And how can we be doing justice to the issues we study and communities we co-create with? And that might actually necessitate different forms of scholarly production, actually to do the kind of work we want. And so how do we actually get that to be acknowledged within the ASA community itself and within American Studies broadly? And that has been a lot of the work of the DH caucus, whether it's the digital shorts to show the multiple kinds of projects that are reflected, whether it's in consulting to help support that kind of work, right? Many of our graduate programs don't actually have a lot of DH training or a lot of, or it's very expensive to go to DHSI or HILT, right? It's not inexpensive to learn the digital humanities. It actually can be very expensive. So how can we actually use the structure of our institution to help make that more affordable and actually co-create together and maybe find connections across that we didn't know before? Also worked really closely, we worked closely with AQ, and this comes to an issue of how structures may be reproducing the kind of logics that we actually problematize. So when American Quarterly came out a few years ago with the announcement that they would do digital project reviews, they announced 2 co-editors that were not visible to the community at ASA. They were 2 individuals who do amazing work and are amazing and do great work, but were not understood as a part of the community within in digital humanities in the ASA. And what the DH caucus asked of AQ was, we've been asking, and members of our caucus have been asking for years for this section, and you finally made it, but you didn't come and ask us who those editors might be. And we had names. People had been offered for years to do that. And so what the caucus said to AQ was, as we look toward the future, how can we make sure that the very editorial, right, those in charge of which projects get reviewed, right, how we review them, actually reflect the field itself. And so we worked with AQ to actually restructure how they choose their editors for our section. I believe, and you can correct me on this, it only applies to this section. So the process now within AQ is that the Digital Humanities Caucus solicits nominations from the community for people who would like to be a digital project editor, and people can either self-nominate or nominate a colleague. And then within that process, those names are sent to the DH caucus, and then those who have been nominated are asked whether they would be willing to serve. They're asked to send in materials about why they would like to serve, very low, brief 1 page, not huge extensive pieces here. And then if there are more than 3 nominees, the steering committee votes to send the send 3 names to American Quarterly. And then the editorial board of American Quarterly decides from within those 3 names who will then circulate on to the DH project's reviews. And on top of that, what we asked was that we actually create a more sort of collaborative model within AQ in which 2 people are editors and 1 person rolls on. Basically everyone serves 3 years, but 1 person rolls on as another person's rolling off. So you're sort of you come on and then you're kind of a past editor, so that they could keep. There were actually really important reasons for a journal. They need stability as well about how you can't be retraining every year for a process. So we actually have a 3-year model for that, which we just are finishing up right now. And so we've actually been working with them to try to rethink even how our journal of record does that kind of work as well in there. The other piece as well is when we had this opportunity to rethink and push back on AQ about their process, we also advocated for a special issue of American Quarterly on the digital humanities, which will be coming out next fall. So we used this moment where the caucus could actually have asks on the institution to rethink itself and to create new openings for the kinds of scholarship we thought should be reflected in the field itself. Which gets to a larger issue, and if I'll wait till the end so we can open up. If I pulled up a series of tabs of like kind of the different projects that reflect the kind of work we're seeing in American Studies, but I think I'll wait to. You want to do that right? Okay, I'll do it really quickly. Yeah. So. Restore previous. Did it clear all the history the second you closed on this? Or did we do it in Firefox or Chrome? Oh, there it is. Sorry. That was silly. I swear I do digital humanities. Where's the other one? Wrong one. There should be a second tab here, though. History. Where's the other? Close, close. There should be a whole nother tab. Okay, well.
You can go into the history of Chrome.
Yeah.
Or maybe share the ones you have and then.
Yeah, these aren't mine, but these are them here. Okay. So I'll just give you a few examples. So what we've been seeing are, for example, things like, no, wow. This is so weird. Okay, we've been seeing like archive projects, and I'll do example like, I can't do this one. Let's just do it this way. This is very. For example, colored conventions, which we've heard about today, but also other projects like Going North. So kind of Omeka archive collection projects have been one big genre. Another have been mapping projects. Or let me show another. Mapping projects. And this is one I know we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow, but for example, mapping inequality out of the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. We've also been seeing games such as, I'm trying to think of, I had, yeah, you'll do that for now. LGBTQ, we've seen other archives, we've seen the games by Elizabeth, yeah. How do you say her last name? Ponce. So games like these. And we've been seeing more, you saw the apartheid project today, 3D modeling, as well as, let's see, it's kind of big ones. And then had other things like, we've seen some more computational work, and this is my own more recent work on using computer vision applied to moving image culture. So we're starting to see sort of different genres in public work with a big emphasis on public's digital humanities as a part of the equation as well. So this gets to my last little part I want to talk about, and we can talk a little bit about, I'm going to bring it out a little bit from ASA and DH to the larger question about DH as a formation outside of American studies. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about the big DH, digital humanities, as understood within a broader context of, say, ADHO, the International Digital Humanities community. And that is that there's a lot of debate about whether we should use the term digital humanities or not. And I would argue that it's a really important term that we continue to use within American Studies and ASA, because if we don't claim that label, we'll be left out of a larger international conversation. And it's really important, the work that comes out of American Studies, because we actually are a fundamentally different formation of the digital humanities than what we're seeing, particularly out of Europe. And what that means if we do not do this is that what we bring, for example, are major critiques of whiteness and issues of racism, and the way that that is being replicated, particularly in other DH formations. And the continual emphasis in text analysis on canons, canons that we know are deeply problematic, that come out of whiteness, they come out of incredible structural inequality, and they come out of protecting the very power structures and very denying the rights of others that we know cultural formations do, right? And that continual canon work actually is something we're constantly trying to fight against. The other is that the important work that post-colonial work is post-colonial DH, Black spatial humanities, Black code studies, Chicano work. We haven't talked a lot about some of the work coming out of Chicana DH, ethnic studies DH, right? These are other formations that are coming into being that are really, really important. Digital ethnic studies that are all saying that we have a much larger set of a much larger world that we need to be imagining when we imagine this field. And then if we also aren't there, we're going to continue to be a part of this issue that's particularly, I think, coming out of a European context of the big DH, where, quote, those of us who do cultural studies and think about theory, or think about the digital studies realm, or we think about building archives, we're not doing hard DH, we're doing soft DH, because hard DH is only algorithms and computational logic. I do computational DH, I love that work, and I think we can do it really well, but and that reinscribes gendered logics about what these fields even look like if we're not a part of that equation as well. So I think that there's a lot of work we have to do as well institutionally to think about how American Studies, all of our fields, and even our national context of the kind, and I know we want to problematize national context, I get that, but we are, when we think about in a broader international world, we do have, that these boundaries and borders are mattering. We've got to figure out how to challenge them in really, really important ways. So that's my bigger challenge, I think, as a group I want to put on the table as we think about the way that DH as a formation is working locally, nationally, globally, and how we continue to problematize that. Because I think these questions are fundamentally a part of American studies. Thank you.
Lol. Tacoma, what's the name of the restaurant we went to for lunch?
Let me not misspeak. It's the one that you recommended.
Cozy Patio?
No.
Corey's Kitchen?
Yeah, Corey's Kitchen.
Corey's Kitchen. So, and this is relevant, don't worry, because I was thinking how, you know, like many of us, I spend a lot of time talking, a lot of time conferencing. It's a huge chunk of just what I do. And I was thinking, as my colleagues on this panel were talking, and I'm just sort of absorbing and really enjoying it, how you know you've won when you rewrite your roundtable panel talk on a napkin or on a placemat. I remember sitting down to lunch today and I looked and I was like, oh, I don't know, all these ideas have been flying around, you know, the last day or so I really got to reprocess. And I literally looked down and it was just this big white, like, placemat. And I was like, oh, and I was like, oh, I am filled with ideas. I mean it. I'm gonna talk a little bit, because I really want us, as Amanda noted, to get to our conversation. But I was thinking about some sort of things that have come up in the past day or so, and thinking about sort of play and pathways, and thinking about sort of what makes sort of play and pathways even just possible. So I'm going to talk a bit, and then I'm going to turn to a little bit of show and tell, and then we'll turn back to the panel and just open it up, to the round table rather, and open it up to conversation. I was thinking, and we were talking a bit at lunch, I thank you for this, Tacoma Peters, and thinking about sort of the role and the place of studies programs in general. Also, like our colleagues, I'm also sort of not in American studies, but through most of my career, I've always been defined as an Americanist. And I remember a really sort of interesting moment back when I was like tiny baby Marissa of graduate school, when I was working on my sort of generalized topic of sort of, you know, history and memory in the American context. So this is coming out of the years of sort of the history and memory debates. So I'm going to date myself a little bit. So we're back in the 90s now, the mid to early 90s, right? And I remember how I had this moment of realizing that most of the examples I wanted to talk about for really specific reasons, non-representational reasons, and I'll get to this in a sec, but that for non-representational reasons, I very much wanted to talk about African American literature and culture. Because at the time, my primary field, along with history and memory, was literary and cultural theory. And I was really struck by the absence of Black voices in a large-scale way. I mean, there were sort of like, and I think we still have this problem now. You get these sort of pillar figures, like Hortense Spillers, right, or Claudia Tate, but they very much stand in as like these pillars. And of course, there's all kinds of people doing the work, and you never hear their names, right? And I was very struck by that at the time. But I also remember sort of being told, well, if you're going to do that, that means you're an African Americanist. And I did my undergraduate, part of my undergraduate degree in political economy, but also in African American studies, African American studies, well, studied African languages for 4 years of college, like the whole shebang, right? So of course I have no discomfort with this, but yet I was uncomfortable, right? It seemed like a very unnecessary distinction. And it's important too to note that at the time I was coming through an English and Comp Lit program that was mainly Comp Lit, so I'm working cross languages, all this stuff, but in that moment, it's like as soon as I said Black, I got pushed out of Americanist in a really sort of interesting way. Not completely, not by everyone, and I had more advocates than non, and just to be clear, but I just want to think about that structurally a bit. So the talk I'm giving today, or not talk, but the sort of provocations I want to give you today are really thinking about what it means to think structurally. And in that case, thinking structurally about the digital humanities in relationship to other institutional configurations. People always ask, how did I go from directing like 5 college digital humanities, like a digital humanities work group, or a very large scale group that literally makes projects. I'm mainly a web developer. I actually make projects. How did I go from that to diversity officer? So I want to sort of show that, map that a little bit today. To me, it seems like a very natural. If you feel immersed enough in systems, right, thinking about the H caucus, thinking about these things, the next logical step actually is to hack bigger things. So when you're thinking about studies programs in general, I think very often different kinds of ethnic studies and also sexuality, women's studies programs often have very complex relationships. I'm talking about the contemporary, very complex relationships with something like American studies, right? In the place of, as American studies, and I'm not talking about, to be clear, I think it's worth the distinction, not quite thinking ASA. ASA, of course, is like the center of American studies, but it's weirdly kind of a little bit different from the way American studies usually plays out on campuses. I just want to be very clear that that's what I'm saying, American studies writ large. It's like the digital humanities with a capital DH, right, is what I'm talking about. You have a very fraught relationship because often in that configuration, what gets called, for instance, like Black studies or Indigenous studies or et cetera, become sort of subset studies, and there are populations to be mined. There are populations to be included. There are populations to be pulled into a larger project. And that's very difficult when you're coming from a studies perspective, for instance, Black or women's studies perspective, because of course part of what's tied into this, and we were talking about this today at lunch, part of what's tied into this, of course, and thank you all for this language, right, so I remember I said this thing at lunch and I was like, oh, this is really about intellectual traditions, when you think about departments, right? And then Gabrielle Foreman's like, well, it's also about ethical traditions, or Takuma's like, it's also about methods and genealogies, it's also about, right? So like between us, right, then Jessica's like, well, don't forget this. I'm like, Jessica, I will not forget, There's a sort of moment that was really interesting, right? And thinking about the ways in which, again, when you're talking about a disciplinary formation, you're talking about all kinds of other things, right? It's that moment, I think, when people first go to ASA, so first go to the American Studies Conference, and they've been hanging out, I'm going to talk other conferences, I apologize, but they've been to other conferences, we'll say, and then they get to ASA and they're like, everyone here is so well dressed. Right? And there's always, and thinking about how in that moment, come on, right? It's true, right? And so it's one of those moments then where like what you're seeing in that isn't just, everyone's very dapper, it's very dope, but it's also thinking about the ways in which that ends up encoding a kind of safety and community that people actually appear looking the ways they like to look versus appearing looking like they think they should look like, right? It's important to be able to thematize that as structural. It's an important thing, but that's not just something that happens. It's not just boo. Oh, wow. You and me, comment time. No, it's bougie AF. And so there's a way, and DH is very bougie too, which I'll end with. I'm part of the problem, don't worry. And so thinking about this and what I'm sort of getting at, I'll move along, is that the underset or the subset of some of this is thinking about the ways in which on the one hand, I think Amanda was getting at this yesterday in their talk, thinking about how, you know, gaming, for instance, you can just correct me if I'm wrong, but how the gaming, for instance, is still video game land, is still lost in the world of thinking about representation, right, and not thinking about structure, right? So this is different than thinking about like your work or Fox Harrell's work or like someone like that, right? That when you're talking about video games and diversity, you're not just saying get me more black characters, you're saying I want a mechanic that's different, right? That's what's so interesting and important about Elizabeth LaPonce's work you were showing, for instance, which I'll say more about also at the end of this presentation. Games that actually work differently. It came up in thinking about archives earlier today in New Zealand, right? What works as an archive in a different community won't look like an archive in another community, right? The example I always use is if you're thinking of black cultures, for instance, I'm going to stereotype this a little bit, where if you're thinking about an elder structure, we all know you don't get to approach an elder and say, tell me X. Right, there's no moment at which, in coming for information, you get to assert dominance. In fact, the only way you can probably, you know, and it's, you know, pros and cons, you know, it's very like, do not come unless I called for you. And you're like, come on, I just got a question, right? It can get intense sometimes. At the other time, however, it also is a way of demonstrating to the person making the inquiry that embedded in the act of making an inquiry should be a certain sort of performance of humility. So what does it mean then, therefore, to produce, for instance, an archival system that requires the inquirer to actually be able to enact a certain kind of humility? This is just a very bad basic, just to make the point very quickly. We can go, you know, on and on in more intricate parts, but I just want to sort of make that. So that moment, therefore, in certain contexts of producing an archive is actually producing a very different structure of even querying database. Right? And interesting, sometimes you might even still have the same kind of database underneath, but the very act of querying would actually queer, right, what constitutes the data that makes up the structural underlayer. I mean, I can say it more technically, but again, I'm just sort of moving quickly. And so thinking about this, I was thinking also about one thing that came up in this sort of conversation, and thinking about sort of the genealogy of how we even produce students. Right? In the sort of show and tell I'm going to give, you'll be a lot more about student work. But sort of thinking about how we also produce students in this. And thinking about how, you know, I think in digital humanities, more so now and always into the future, at the moment of hiring, at the moment of beginning a project, at the moment of sort of embarking, there's a real problem of figuring out what to do with like subject specialists against digital specialists, against technical folk, and so on and so forth. And the ways in which that if you're doing digital work, there's an expectation of a certain kind of technical proficiency. But, and I would thank you always, Catherine Steele, for this, you know, sort of quote, but just sort of thinking about, you know, this notion that the digital will come. Right? At the end of the day, if we care about our fields, we care about our subfields, we care about the communities out of which we come, it's important to note that our practices, our methods, our genealogies, our habits, our clothing, whatever those things may be, and I mean it, have to come first. Right? But then what does it mean in the context of larger disciplinary formations to center studies programs? When the real values of digital humanities is this notion that different disciplines and smaller disciplines, video game studies, black studies, so on and so forth, don't have to be subsumed. They're as large as any other discipline. But unfortunately, in the context of institutional formation, they've often also only been brought into the fold to do the work of representation. People are shocked, you know, and I gave this very kind of, you know, example of the ways in which, you know, more and more so, and this is a good thing and a bad thing. I think it's mainly bad, but it has a lot of good in it. That was definitely realm of opinion. That now, for instance, it's very common to see so many kinds of applications, grant applications, project ideas, et cetera, that really want to work very honestly with, for instance, Black and Indigenous and Latino archives, or have found amazing materials in those archives. And the people are very earnest, so to be clear, but but at the same time, often have no training in the studies programs, right, that would give them sort of the context for this. I know Gabrielle Foreman will be talking more about this idea of genealogy and context. I was really struck, I think as many of us were, during Jessica Johnson's keynote yesterday, when she kept reminding us that when we're thinking about citational practice, we're not just even thinking about like, you know, works cited, but that it's a larger practice of citationality, it's genealogy, whose words, what little sparks got you here, and I thought that was very striking, because that's a way of thinking very differently about what citation citation even does. It's not just cite more Black women, cite more Latinos, cite, more communities, include more communities. It means change the fundamental relationship of what counts as information flowing from those communities, right? And I can do a whole thing that's very important about this, about the ways in which very often you'll hear something at a talk or you'll read something in passing in a non-academic space, but because of the politics of citation, it's difficult. I've had people say to me, oh, I learned this thing from a talk you gave, but I didn't know how to cite it. But no, you're there. I'm like, I'm not there. If you didn't say it, I'm not there, right? I appreciate it, and it's heartfelt, right? But it's really real to think about this. That requires a different kind of practice, right? Sometimes bending the rules, but there have to be people there as well who are allowing others to bend the rules. So if we're thinking then about studies work in the digital humanities, and I don't have much time for this, but again, thinking about what happens to smaller disciplines that also already have excellent relationships with the communities that we're talking about, particularly around the sort of archival work, right? So sometimes it's not it's like quote easy, I guess, but when you're thinking like, if you have a local community that is mainly racialized or mainly of a class stress, et cetera, there's that moment like, well, how do we connect to that community? One way to connect sometimes is to think about the work that other institutions or other, even academic communities have done to make those connections. It's often just different, and that often gets missed out. I won't name institutions, but I have to admit I've seen really striking moments of institutions, for instance, that are placed near predominantly Black neighborhoods, and you'll have someone in the English department saying, I was thinking of this partnership, I want to do this, but I don't even know where to start. I want to make sure I'm attending to the people, and I'm going to call a community conversation. And again, all those things were good, but I was like, you could also go down the hall and knock on the door of your colleague who has been working on the population of this, these people in this population for literally 30 years. That Black woman you never talked to, who's your colleague, whose name you don't seem to know? Okay, that was unnecessary, but kind of the point, right? And so thinking about that, and to be clear, I'm not trying to reify this notion of the academic over the community. That's not the separation you should be seeing here. But that very often there are large extant bodies of knowledge that are already in place that you could also be accessing in the moment of trying to branch out to new communities. Right? I'm thinking of a conference I was at last week, a very useful conference put on by Meredith McGill and Jackie Goldsby. And it was this sort of, amazing moment talking about Black bibliography. And you just realize that Black bibliographic work has been happening for hundreds of years, and you have these people producing these amazing, reams and reams of paper, of information, of every single thing written by a Black person during a certain era in a certain place. And that information, because it was never taken seriously by libraries, was mainly lost or sitting in grandma's attic right now somewhere. Right? So it's not that the stuff is new. This is the Columbusing thing that Johnson is pointing us to. It's not that the stuff is new, it's just new to you, right? Or new to me, to be clear. I had to get the rhyme of new to you, but to be clear, I include me in that. So thinking about that, and thinking, therefore, about what it means to think about inclusion as also broadening and repairing some of the harm that's been done by the actual institutional configurations in which we dwell. That was the point of those stories put together. And thinking also about sort of the ways in which so much of what we think of as academic progress today is often tied to a certain kind of ownership. It's property. You have that thing that no one has. You have this perspective that no one else understands. You have this archive that you found and no one else has access to. You come from a background or speak a language that no one else speaks in this community, and therefore you have, and all those things are incredibly valuable, don't get me wrong, but it becomes very complex when you're thinking about the lives of marginalized people as themselves, again, as it's been brought up in this conference, becoming a property. And even when it's owned by people or parlayed by people within those communities, to be honest, because the academic context does change. Some of it, being compensated does change things. It's hard to talk about, but it's true. And so thinking about this gold mine, and thinking about also the ways in which when one discovers something, the thing that's discovered is a literal professional gold mine. But if it were to be discovered by someone who's understood as too closely connected to the thing that has been discovered, then it's just more example of including the marginalized. So the very status of the object of inquiry also changes by virtue of the person who is making the presentation of the materials themselves. And how do we think about that? That's a structural problem. So that's the kind of stuff I want us thinking about. I'm trying not to repeat. I keep looking at my watch. I'm trying to just go very, very fast. In thinking about this also, because it becomes a way of sort of orthogonally coming to the same conversation we started with, that's already been brought to our attention, of thinking about citation, thinking about scooping and stealing, what it means to do public humanities work that goes uncited, and who's doing that work. There's been a lot of talk about the sort of, affective labor of social media, of Black people and women, particularly in social media, but there's an academic side of that as well, right? But it's difficult because ultimately, if you care in the original structural idea of the, quote, academic enterprise, you're supposed to be able to step back and say, well, I don't really care who that belongs to because it's just the important thing is that it got said. But it becomes very complex of thinking about people from different communities. I was at a conference in critical digital humanities last year, and there was this weird moment in the room where we were talking about peer review and what goes wrong in peer review and so on and so forth. And the answer became, well, you just remove the names from everything. And if you just remove the names from everything, but also even when people publish things, remove the names. And I had this moment, I was sitting there, I was like, wow, just when all the brown people start getting in the door, that shit won't have names on it no more, right? That stuff won't be citable anymore, is what I meant to say. But it was striking to me. But there's a way in which that moment of saying, take the names off of everything, it wasn't a push against anything, or a push against me, or a push against people of color, or women, or so on and so forth. I think it was genuine. But it's difficult because sometimes the temporality is of different people with membership in a single institution are not always the same. Right? And so there's a way in which some of that, take the names off, is sort of like, oh, we're done with this, let's move on. For other people, like, just got here. And I don't want to move on with the thing that I already find lacking. To move on with that would be to, in fact, reinstitute something terrible, and probably worse because it's so uninterrogated as well. And so thinking about this, and really, again, holding on to sort of Catherine's sense of the digital will come. What it means, on the one hand, keep the digital at the center of inquiry, but also understand that the digital and digital studies and digital humanities with small d's and large d's and et cetera are themselves configurations that, as we've been had point out to us repeatedly, should be transformed. Now, I know that when people say things, and I'll transition here, about they should be transformed, that it's important to note that this is not actually an abstraction. Right, and it's really, this is the hardest part, and that's why I want to do a little bit of show and tell to sort of think about this. Because one thing I've noted also, in my work as a diversity officer, I'll pivot just a little bit. One thing you find is that when you're talking about diversity and inclusion and changing institutions, things that do different, I'm very nitty-gritty, like things that do different in searches, that sort of thing, right? There's a way in which almost anyone you talk to will always be able to hear you and say the right thing. Because cognitively, I think they very often do understand what's at stake and what matters and why you're asking them to do whatever you're asking them to do. In practice, however, it plays out differently. And I've been really struck by this. It's the same with classes, right? With classrooms, where I have classrooms. If I just ask a random student with very little background in social justice and et cetera, and I lay out a scenario, we read a story, and we talk about it, they're gonna be on top of it. They're just like, I get this, I can interrogate this, I see how these systems fit together, but they can still walk out of that classroom and shit on somebody else, right? And so there's a way in which that moment in the classroom isn't quite translating into action. I want to take some responsibility off the individual with this and really think about the ways in which the individual, of course, also ventriloquizes a structure, right? And so how do we, if anything, liberate people from being the mere puppets of the system? So one way of thinking about this, and combined with this notion of coming to the digital, or thinking about, I wanted to show you all some projects we've been working on, first at 5 College Digital Humanities with the undergraduate fellowships, just to give some practical ideas about way of doing some of this. I know other programs are doing things as well. One thing we attempted, I used to be the director of 5 College Digital Humanities, one thing we built in that program was this idea of the undergraduate fellowship. And the idea was that we would give undergraduates year-long fellowships with enough money to replace work time, money to travel to conferences, they could meet other people, money that they could, for instance, hire their friends who are graphic artists who are going to work with them to help them make parts of their sites. We teach them how to budget, how to make spreadsheets, how to work with vendors, right? So the real sort of nitty-gritty of project management. right? And we work with students across schools no matter what their discipline, right? We ask that the students, of course, have advisors and et cetera, but we're also a standalone program. And these are very often students doing full projects in addition to their theses, in addition to their coursework, and we try to honor that. But it's really interesting thinking about what it means to give people a space to flourish outside the structure they're used to, but in ways that can still be acknowledged by the structure, right? And I was thinking last year, and part of how we came to IRL, which is the lab I'm running now, part of how we came to that is that over the years, we began to see all the ways in which student, particularly undergraduate, but also even faculty projects, can't quite fit into the timelines of the academic structure. Right, so we started IRL simply as a way to keep working with student projects for people who are no longer students. Because by the time you really get a student who's had a couple of years of training, who's taking the good classes across all the schools, who've come up with a project idea, who've done the subject area research, and et cetera, you're looking at a second semester senior who's like, I'm ready to get started. Do you see what I mean? And so we had to find a way to keep projects going after they graduated, right? And some of these projects, or two of them I'll show you today, were really interesting because they're projects in which we really had to take up some of the questions of what transforms or what changes in thinking about one, student work, and two, thinking about work produced by people from certain communities or working with certain communities and the kinds of questions they had to ask to make sure they were structurally doing something different. Now, it's important to note that in order to do something structurally different, it does mean at every moment that person has to absolutely commit to change. We talk a lot about failure. I thought Angel Nieves had it extreme, like just right with talking about the messiness of the process and that messiness itself. You really see that with student projects, right? So this was a project by a student in the Black Studies department at Amherst, Kristen Washington, who very much was struck by this notion, and this is some background. She is Black identified. She's from Brooklyn. And she was in a class, you know, it was a great class, but they were reading all these stories and literally at one point, or all this history, and at one point one of the books is like, you know, when Brooklyn disappeared. And it's all this, I don't know if you know this kind of Brooklyn stuff, but it's all this, when Brooklyn disappeared, oh, it's when the Dodgers left, it's oh, when this happened, it's oh, when this happened. But the underside of that story is Brooklyn disappeared when the Black people got there. Right, so this thing with the Brooklyn accent, the Brooklyn story, the Brooklyn this, the Brooklyn that, it all ends with the appearance of Blacks, right? And so she began this sort of multimodal approach in thinking about what it means to talk about a population that gets referred to as a negative, as an absence, as to go back to Johnson's talk, a null, right? A nullification of the idea of a space, right? And she began thinking about all the things you would have to do to be able to make that claim. And so she began, therefore, looking at the different sort of digital strategies she could use to help this population emerge, right? So she did an amazing project, for instance, where she worked with, for instance, making from scratch using census data, maps in GIS to show that, one, Blacks didn't just appear in Brooklyn, they had been there from the beginning. Because Brooklyn was a place of slavery for a very long time in farmland. So even the very narrative of appearance and disappearance, right, you see where I'm going with this, was already, so she's doing a GIS project using census data that shows these are some of the maps just over time, right? You definitely see an increase in people, but there was never a moment of no people. And you can map along sort of the historical claims being made about the absence and disappearance of people in Black Brooklyn by watching the encroachment of Black people into formerly white neighborhoods. So the story of disappearance isn't even a story of arrival, it's a story of desegregation, right? And then immediate resegregation, which is a fancy way of saying white flight. But she was also interested in making sure that she was never showing that people had disappeared. And again, really thinking also in that moment of what it means to have to think about the people who are still there. So for instance, she was in a place where she realized that she was talking about the question earlier, she's talking about the living. And so how do you bring the livingness back? And so she made up this idea of producing sort of living memorials. So she has this map and you can click all these different places and they would take you, I don't remember how to make the little guide, oh wait, to the little 360 panoramas that she was making to show you historical places in Brooklyn, what they look like today, And if you have on like a Google Cardboard, you're in a full immersive look around. And I have it turned off now, but there's also sound. So you hear people talking, her talking about the space and so on. Well, if anyone who spends a lot of time in Brooklyn today knows, if you're staying in the street and you're a black girl with a fancy camera, people are going to talk to you. And part of what came from this also, therefore, is this notion of a photo series. She did work in historical archives, finding historical images of Black Brooklyn. So these are key to all the places you saw on the previous screen. And then she would find people on the street or her friends to hold up a picture of the place today. So this is a way of engaging the community, engaging people, just walking around saying, hey, hold this photo. And of course, very often they're like, oh, my grandma went to this church, and a story. So again, if you're looking at the site, there's sound and stuff going on also, right? And this is also, and I'll start wrapping up here, an interesting example of also thinking about what happens to sustainability. When you look at the site, it's a very big, it's divided actually into 5 sites. Just using WordPress. We did all this fancy work actually to build a new platform, do all this sort of programming, all this sort of stuff. And then we realized that at the end of the day, we really want to over even sustainability right now or into the future. We can build that next new archival thing, and the metadata is actually in place, the back end is all in place. But that right now, we want to just be able to show people what we did, how we did, and they can do it too. So we actually pulled back a lot of the proprietary technologies we had produced and turned to sort of open box, turnkey, open access stuff. So we went the opposite way. Because with the long-term sustainability, we decided right now is a little bit less important than making sure we could spread this. And part of this project also, I don't have the images, because I don't have permission to show them yet, is taking the VR making technology and 360 immersive camera technology into middle schools in Brooklyn. So a lot of the images you see in the other place were also taken by middle school photography students who we were able to give cardboards and like hit their cousins up to borrow their phones for one day. It was a whole thing, you know? So we had enough mobile technology. So really pulling back into not necessarily minimal technologies, but available technologies and showing people how to do this kind of work using only the available technologies. The last thing I'll say that goes with this also to another project, which is really interesting to think about, was another project we did at IRL, previously called Indigenous Imaginaries. And this was a project that had us sort of thinking about, or a student, it was a thesis project by Cassandra Herdil, who identifies as white, but was working with Indigenous communities, which is important, and particularly working with Indigenous gaming communities. So again, when you're thinking of changing things from the inside, thinking about what it means to have to say, I want to produce this work about these communities of which I'm not a part, and the very difficult, constant conversations that come out of that, and even what you can show and what you can't show, and what you can say and what you can't say, what it means, and the scholars and us understand, what it means to write about populations and have to run it back by them again, right, to get the sign off on whether or not it's okay to talk about it. So thinking about that, and sort of thinking about what's at stake therefore in representing communities that are not our own, but again, as we've always pointed out, working in cooperation. But that in the act of educating students and thinking about this, that you also get to the place where you're thinking about sort of what's at stake in the structure. So I'm just going to show you a very small thing, and then I'll end here. So for all these projects I'm showing you, they also write critical essays. And we've been writing those essays in Twine, which is very easy to use interactive game making software that we've been using for academic use as well. And one thing we were talking about with this project, here's an example. So I had this idea, right? And I wanted to, and we worked on it for another project, where if you see this, so this is a branching narrative, and the way it works is that every time you click, where you previously went also stays on the page. So it's like you're building the essay as you go through. It's a style we've been using a lot. We really like it. And I, because I'm a completist and purist of the web development, really wanted it so that these citations, right, would actually be a pop-up box. And we had done this before. So you click the footnote, and a kind of persistent box, or a box would pop up over here or a separate window. And the student, and I think she was right, was very firm in saying, no, I want those citations at the bottom of every single page. And I was like, it's kind of clunky, because then you can't see, and continues here, and there's a line here, and oh God, there's 2 lines on one screen. You get very caught up in these things as a web designer. And she just made the simple point. It's like, look, we're talking about people writing text and talking about things that are always stolen. I don't want there to even be a click between people seeing where these citations are coming from. And it was that moment, it's a small thing, but it was like, doop. understanding the distancing and the click. And this thing that on the one hand is best practices, web design was not best practice as a community practice, right? And there are a lot of things I probably can't click through quickly enough. So for instance, there are a lot of really boring but exciting things. For instance, around where we were storing all the media. So there's a lot of gameplay on this site that you can look at, not just images. And thinking about ways to make sure that we're setting up servers to which the creators actually have access if they want to change, so they can change but keep the same persistent link. So there are a lot of things around that to produce sort of community participation or not good practice in the digital space. But that good practice in the digital space couldn't be the thing that was actually holding the project together, that it was not actually the right heuristic through which to be thinking about what constitutes good work and good practice. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite the panelists if they have anything that they wanted to raise with each other or follow-up comments, and then we will throw it open to anyone who has thoughts they'd like to share. Lauren, do you feel like you want to say something? No.
I think with the time would be, I think,
The audience? Okay. Questions then, please.
So I just wanted to clarify one thing from Professor Parham's fabulous presentation and the IRL. So you work with those students for years, it sounds like? I mean, they entered. Okay.
Well, some. I mean, Kristen, the two projects I showed today, part of what was interesting about them, why I thematized so much, but these are two students I had never worked with before, who had never done any digital work before embarking on these huge scale, hundreds of pages projects, like community-based learning, let's work in the schools projects. So it really, it drove a lot of stuff home.
So how many years would it take for a student to complete something like the Black Brooklyn project?
It depends on the student. Kristen got this done in 3 months.
Wow.
But it took But it took a lot of structural finesse, a lot of course release for myself and for her. At one point, we sort of looked up and realized she had a semester where she was taking 3 special topics courses. It was completely reasonable. But even having a student in a department that was willing to do that and little things we had to do to make sure that was still sort of educationally credit hour sound, which it was, but making sure it changed what we meant to document a project, because a lot of documentation stuff you have to do for a student in 3 special topics in 1 semester, and it's possible, but it's different, right? So we learned a lot. I don't recommend it, though, the 3-month or 4-month process version of this. And I guess she started GIS sooner, so a total of 8 months. But it just depends on the kind of structure in which you're working. Because for this project, I said it very glibly, but sustainability is really a thing. And we're probably, to get that done and get it done well, with even generous schedules, we're probably looking at another 2 years of work.
And she's still working on it? Is she one of the students that?
Former student, yes.
So can you explain a little bit about how your institution works that? I mean, so she's employed now by the institution?
No, she just has a job in her jobby life back in New York. And we run IRL with independent funds and support from the institution. So we make sure that any student who's still enrolled in the institution is getting supported by the institution. And then we use all kinds of other funding, and she has sought out other small grants, et cetera, to fund the lab work. So the lab work is separate from the larger institution financially, which is a way of saying hashtag own your own servers, own your own shit, and et cetera. Yeah, I think so. Oh, it's not on.
Is it?
What is?
Yeah, it's on.
It's on? It's on. Yeah, okay. Just in case, I don't know. Somebody's watching. Big Brother's watching. Thank you, all of you, for these amazing presentations and amazing projects and the work that you guys have been doing in the Academy and in American Studies to kind of create this space. Lauren saying thinking about the ways that American Studies and DH and American Studies especially situated to be an intervention in global DH. I take that so seriously, and I think it's such an important way to think about the contribution that ethnic studies, that all of the interdisciplinary studies bring to what can be a very disciplinary angle in the digital humanities, capital D, capital H, and that American Studies, the U.S., is really positioned to break that wide open and to be a global partner in that conversation in a way that really opens it up and is ethical and is an act of social justice for everybody involved. So along those lines, I would love to hear, especially from the senior scholars on the panel, about the ways that, because what I also hear in everybody here is that there is a role that we all can play, even within our institutions, in continuing to make space and in being interventions in the work that we do. And I also hear the ways that the work has been very precarious and difficult to do and hard to do with limited resources and colleagues with different levels of accountability and investment. So I'd love to hear from the senior scholars especially, but from everyone, what are, for graduate students, for undergraduates, for graduate students, for junior scholars, and even for senior scholars, what are concrete things that, keeping in mind the structure that we are working in within the university, that we can do? What kind of, let me phrase it differently, what is the actual power that we have at our different levels that we are not taking advantage of, that maybe we're scared to take advantage of, or we worry about our precarity too much? And what kind of moves would you like us to be making at each level to step into pushing this even further forward, keeping in mind all of the things we've been saying about justice and erasure and null values and that?
As oldest person, so I'll go with that. I know
the senior scholars on the panel.
I was like, I think it's figuring out. So I don't want to speak incorrectly. So just grain of salt, because I'm going to be quick. So I think one of the most difficult things about any oppressive structure, and I take this from Sarah Ahmed, are the ways that they tend to individualize struggle. So that any struggle that's happening against the institution is your personal problem, it's a thing you did, a thing that happened to you, and et cetera. Right, this is the underside of your question. I'm gonna come back on top in a second. And so with that in mind, we have to figure out ways to, one, subvert that, to collectivize when possible. That's why the American Quarterly example, the DH caucus, is so incredibly, that word caucus is important, as a political term, is important, right? It's constituency, it's group, it has meaning. But also thinking about the places where we can parlay to turn on its head the individuations. You know, so I'm thinking, so an example I would give at an institution like mine, which is not uncommon, or your yearly, if you're an untenured person, it's a little bit different if you're a contingent, but not very, but particularly in the case of untenured, the yearly conversations you have about your scholarship. What can you do to make sure that by the time you get to that conversation, the people with whom you're working, your senior colleagues, are as educated as possible? And educating these people is difficult because they don't like being talked down to, right? For a variety of reasons. And so what can you do? Who are the people you bring to your own campus, right? Who can you bring to your campus to move along the conversation in a demonstrable way in front of other people so that they understand that when you show up, what you're talking about without you having to say it, right? And also making sure that in a moment of conversation about your work, that you're always contextualizing it and that they're recording that contextualization. Right, you should have an annual review that's talking about iteration, that's talking about peer review, that's talking about grant writing, so that all those things are on the table. Because there's a way in which, on the one hand, so much of what goes wrong in academia and the play of power is about soft structures of power being brought down very hard on people's heads, but also remembering there are processes of sort of documentation and pathways that actually are clear,
that we could have more control over? That was a really boring answer to your really interesting question, but you know, I tend to systematize. But I think it's very important, and that there's always work. And that's why, again, that work from something like American Quarterly becomes so important, because every time you're doing that community work and having someone doing that work of editing, at the end of the day, if that person didn't get people to their institution, didn't start those conversations, they have that CV line, and it matters, right? And again, we talk about hacking the structure and having it matter less, but it still does also matter. And so navigating that's going to always be different by institution, but you really have to make sure that, one, that you're always keeping people informed and educated, and two, that for better or for worse in academia, that's usually not work that anyone can do at any level. I would say this even at full, that you really can't do for yourself, because institutions mainly work by the ways in which it can imagine itself in relationship to other institutions. So you almost always need some sort of outside force or voice to help contextualize transformation from within. I didn't want that to be recorded. I don't want institutions to change it. Like, oh, we're going to change it up.
Yeah.
Don't catch us. But I don't.
Along those lines, maybe Lauren or Amanda, one thing in your first slide, I think, Amanda, that you put up about some of the projects that the caucus is involved in, some of them seem to be targeted towards starting the conversations with institutions so they're prepared to evaluate people who are doing DH work. Is there something beyond the caucus itself trying to set standards for, say, tenure and promotion? Are there conversations with people who are situated outside of American Studies Association but in institutions about how to create a safe path for young scholars who are trying to do this work with the backing, say, of your caucus, that they're doing good work, but then how do you communicate that to the institutions and help facilitate that for them?
I'll talk briefly about that because I want to then come to the contingent question too.
Please.
I think one of the things that has happened is that we've seen a series of TMP guidelines coming out from a series of academic organizations. So American Historical, I'm going to get this wrong, American Religious History group has come out with a set of guidelines. American Sociological Society, I'm going to get there, they are coming out with guidelines about social media and how it counts. As well as, I'm missing, MLA has come out with guidelines. I know people in this room have worked on those, so shout out to all of y'all. So what we're doing in ASA right now, and the DH Caucus, is looking at all of those within our subcommittee to figure out, do we need to come out with slightly different guidelines? Do we adopt those guidelines? Do we merge them? Do we remix? What exactly do we do in order to create TMP guidelines? But I think the one thing that we've seen, and I think I want to say that, like, even as a junior faculty member in which there's a lot of precarity, I am greatly fortunate to be in a context in which something like 20% of academic jobs is when you're TNP or tenure track anymore. There's some, I'm going to get the stat wrong here, but we've seen incredible reduction in tenure track lines. And I'm deeply privileged now to be among those who've been fortunate enough to be in that, and also to be, in my own subjectivity, positioned also to benefit from some of these structures, right? So it's incumbent upon me to, and I think my colleagues, to acknowledge that even though I feel senses of precarity, I'm sitting within positions of privilege as well, and to try to be an ally, to think about how I can do service on ASA, how can I do the things that help create a better context as well. And which is to say that we've become really, I think, and this is a lot of the work of Amanda and Fiona and others in the room, to think about how contingent labor, particularly the world of DH postdocs and DH kind of IT jobs, have sort of been the way that a lot of DH labor is actually being formulated. And that's where I want to turn to Amanda about the work that y'all have been doing.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, we're in a similar sort of position where there are people who have written a lot about contingent labor in academia generally, and sort of thinking about in our project to focus in some ways on the digital humanities question, like how much are we looking at different issues? And this is something that Jessica brought up on our roundtable at ASA last year, where you know, she made the very astute observation that the DH postdocs and contingent workers mirror what's happening in Black studies, what's happening in women's studies, what's happening in these other positions that add diversity to an institution but are not supported in any sort of meaningful way, right? It's a way to make sure we have the bodies there that we need, and sure, you're doing sort of like cute, innovative work, but it doesn't fit into this larger structure. And on the question of what the institution recognizes as work or as valuable, particularly on the tenure track, but I think that also translates into who gets put into contingent positions, right? Because if your work is not recognizable as something that's going to get you tenure eventually, your consideration for tenure track positions is in question already. I mean, I don't know, it's that frustration of lots of people have said lots of things about, these projects are valuable, that we need to recognize them. And I've heard various stories about where the holdup is, right? And where the change is being sort of stopped. And the most interesting thing that I heard at one institution was that upper administration feels it's happening at the level of departments, and that department colleagues can't read their own sort of department members' work as legible. Of course, you hear the other side of that too, where the department fully supports the work of their colleague, and it's happening at the upper administration level. So there's a little bit of confusion, right, about who is holding up this process, and that sort of indicates this is a systemic process, right? It's not about the individuals in the system at all. It's about, that system and the way it's put together. And I don't know, and sort of reaching that moment of despair, it's like, what do we do as a caucus? What can we do? How many white papers can we put out? How many people can we have clamoring for, recognition of this type of work before someone somewhere flips whatever switch or opens whatever circuit or gate that needs to just let it go through?
Can we have a couple extra minutes since we started late?
We started very late.
I return this time back into the room.
Thank you.
So my question is for Marissa, and it has to do with the labor issue of not only doing the second shift of digital work, but doing the third shift of diversity work. And I think this is a challenge for many institutions in thinking about the sustainability of labor that is not only very time intensive, like anybody who has sat there with an Omeka project doing find and replace, like that is slow going. So not only is it labor intensive work, but it's also work that is often perceived of as service rather than research. So both diversity work and digital humanities work are seen in that, through that lens. So how have you negotiated that? And I think this is a question also that many of us can bring back to our institutions in thinking about how do we not burn people out?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could sell that secret sauce. I think, I don't know. I can tell you what I've done.
Okay, that would be really helpful.
And this is just for me, my particular institution has particular imaginations about itself and so on. And as much as possible, I'll try to expand out and go quickly. For me, I know it's been making sure that every aspect of the enterprise that is me informs the other. And working very hard at that in very sort of material ways. But also sometimes sort of taking a stand in sort of fake risky ways. And I don't mean fake, well, I do mean fake. So I'm thinking of when I decided or was asked to come up for promotion, and I decided to come up to promotion on collaborative and digital work and no written work. And I had written work and I withheld it on principle. But it's fake because I had a job and I wasn't going to lose my job. And if it was wrong, if it's, got whatever and like, the cats reproduced and I needed more money and I had to get promoted, I could like pull out these articles or whatever. Right? So it's definitely fake, but you see what I mean. And have to like just force the question. Because at some point and at certain moments, there are all these pivot points where you have to force the question. Because everyone will talk again, they'll say the right things and speak abstractly about thinking about your work in the community and your engagement work and your this and your that. And then they get there and they go, it's like the person who can't cite the talk. They're like, well, I don't know what to do with this. That's part of that story of like the department being blamed by the administration blames. And it goes back and forth, right? They're all telling the truth about what happened in that moment, but no one is systematizing the structure, right? What's happened, literally what's happened. And no one, and also particularly I'm at a private institution, so everything that happens around tenure promotion and hiring is actually so secret, right? And there's an added layer of complexity, for better or for worse, that comes with that. So making sure that aspects of the enterprise always meet each other. I'm thinking back to what Angel Neves was saying during his talk about, I forgot who was in response to, I think it was in response to a question, but the ways in which, one way you deal, I think it was Amanda, thinking about Lacastro, thinking about sort of, one way you kind of help keep students from doing this sort of like kind of bad work of empathy. I'm right? That was, okay. And thinking about one way you do that is making sure you're talking about it constantly. You don't just talk about the moment of like writing a paper or the moment of going to community or the moment of something, but it actually infuses everything you read, the choices you make, how you choose to talk, how you structure, and some people who are more into pedagogy have amazing stuff, and we all know this around like how you structure the classroom and where you put the seats and how you talk about the classroom and so on and so forth. They often, to I think many people in this room, seem like small things because we're used to them, but they're revolutionary. And so for me, that work of diversity was engaging actually the center of my intellectual practice. And so how do I make that legible, right? That's why anytime I talk about digital humanities, I talk about diversity. It's not because I'm on a diversity high horse, but I think they're structurally interesting to each other, going back to the example you were giving and thinking about contingent labor in relation to studies departments that you were saying in relation to Jessica Johnson as well. And so thinking about that and just thinking about how as much, also to be clear, I'm kind of lazy. And so at the end of the day, it's also about how to make things count for as many things as possible at every moment. Right? And also teaching students almost certain kind of marketing skills so that the things that they value around coming to a minority majority, which means they're not a minority, what else, institution. And so making sure the things that they tend to care about are things that they say across classes, right? If you're sitting and this happens in unnamed department class and you're in an unnamed department class, at some point, it should be strange that all this, like you're the only non-white student. How does that even happen at a majority minority institution? Why would any department or any class that's more than, because we're a small place, that's more than like 15 or 20 people be all white? That's hard. You had to work at that, right? But of course, it's also transparent. I still have most people walk into class and it's like, it's so diverse in here. I'm like, the whole institution's diverse and I teach all kinds of people. But diversity is not a given, it's still an exception. So how do you flip the rhetoric in such a way? I'm sorry, I'm over answering, but how do you flip rhetoric in such a way so that the baseline for the conversations encompass the work and the care and the concerns, right? So you're not doing double work, you're just making sure that work that's considered not the thing includes the thing. So that my example would simply be the same critical DH conference where it's like the next day someone's like, I can't believe we spent all of yesterday, we never even got to DH, we were just talking about diversity. And someone's like, no, that was talking about DH. Do not erase that. And like having to know when you're gonna pull and draw that line. Or if you don't have the power to get someone else to do it for you or to do it in concert, right, with multiple people, because academia is weird and we feel left out real quick. So that's a thing sometimes that has to be parlayed as well.
Yeah, and if I could just continue off of that, the marketing skills are so key, right? And that was sort of behind what happened with Transform DH, which wasn't exactly intentional. It was sort of this happy accident where we learned about marketing all of a sudden. And so we sort of fell into this hashtag that got picked up for various reasons. And And then it became apparent that claiming these names is important, making DH people think that we're doing DH so that we become DH is important. And I hesitate to say this on a recording, but it also reminds me of a DH caucus-sponsored roundtable at ASA a couple of years ago where we were talking about getting grant funding, right, and learning how to sort of adopt the language of the funders to get the money to do what you actually want to do, right? Because once you get that money, I mean, there's accountability measures, but there's also a lot of like things that you can do on your own. And so I always use a sort of example of like, I got a dissertation completion fellowship and used it to make like a Slash video, which I told them, I'm going to be producing media, but, I created this like lesbian love story out of a really violent video game and put ACLS's name on it. Like, LOL. Thanks, guys.
And you need someone on the other side to sit with a straight face at the moment of evaluation and go, well, she said she doesn't produce media. This is media. I really mean it. That's part of what you know.
So yeah, the marketing skills are key. Learn those languages and then, use the resources for what you actually wanted to do in the first place.
And senior people go to bat. It's like the contingent labor and everything else. I think about this all the time, famous last words, dear Lord. But if you're afraid of doing something, because with tenure, we all know you can still lose your job. You were already in a path and you were going to lose it anyway. And so there's a way in which you want to be careful, of course, about structures of self-disciplination. This is one of the ways in which power ends up, as we know, speaking through us, because we imagine somehow that we've already seen the future of that punishment. And actually, academia in many cases, department is actually quite distributed. And so there's also in that kind of paranoia that I find discomfiting sometimes, particularly around contingent labor stuff and other, in the treatment of postdocs and so on and so forth.
I think we may have taken more of extra time than we can. I'm sorry, I see other questions. I hope there'll be chances to have those discussions informally. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.